Everybody, welcome, welcome, welcome. This is pretty exciting. Welcome to the first ever online symposium for the Society for Economic Botany. And if you aren't aware, I am Nancy Ross. I am the president of the Society for Economic Botany, and really delighted that we have so many people joining us today, and we have a really amazing lineup of speakers for today. And so if you are new to the SEB, our society, we are an international society of academics and scholars who our goal is to explore and illuminate plant-people relationships. And we all begin our exploration of these relationships from really different places. And I teach at a small university in central Iowa, which is basically smack dab in the middle of absolutely nowhere. And I'm actually this fall, I'm teaching Introduction to Ethnobotany. And if any of you know me, you know that a lot of my work is from an ecological perspective. I'm very quantitative and theory-based and all of that. But for my class, the first thing that I had my students read was the introductory chapter for this really beautiful book called Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer. If you haven't read it, it is rather beautiful. And the introductory chapter is this really evocative origin story of how humans became members of our shared ecosystem and how we developed our relationships, began developing our relationships with the other members of our ecosystem, with the plants and animals in our system. And it's just a really beautiful, the reason I use this, it's such a beautiful story to help us to begin to see the world and these relationships between people and plants from different perspectives and see how people are coming at this from very different places. And I think this is the promise of ethnobotany, of our discipline, is this ability for us to show and to explore and illuminate all these different paths to knowledge. But another benefit of coming from this common discipline is it gives us some shared steps along our different paths so that we can come together and we can share our knowledge and we can share exploration and we can really learn from one another. And so I really think that that is represented in what we have here today in this symposium. So we were unable to meet together in person this summer, and hopefully we'll be able to get together again soon. But this is so exciting that we have such a huge crowd of people from all over the world, and we have speakers from all over the world who are coming to show their work and this really amazing diversity of ideas and knowledge and new information. It's really, really exciting. So I wanted to say again, welcome, welcome, welcome. I'm so happy that everyone was able to join us. And so I wanted to, before I step off and give this over to the organizers, I wanted to say, if you are new to the Society for Economic Botany, we would be delighted if you wanted to join us to join the society, and hopefully we will continue to offer opportunities with us, even if we can't come together in person. This is a really amazing opportunity for us to share what we do and to learn from other scientists and scholars around the world and to learn these different perspectives and these different pathways. And it's pretty exciting. So we would love it if you wanted to join us so you can, hopefully you will enjoy this symposium today. I think you will, it's pretty exciting. And so before I go, I also wanted to say a huge thank you to the organizers for today's meeting. So John De La Parra, if we could, everyone should be clapping wildly right now. Because John has really, he was the guy who just volunteered to just jump in and guide this symposium to its fruition. And so huge thank you to John for doing this, as well as to Heather Kennedy and Amelia Neely and the crew in the BSA office for helping us do the logistics of making this work, as well as we had two people who are other supporters for helping to organize the panelists, Lucas Pawera and Karsten Fatur. Thank you so much, guys, for helping us out. And so I really, again, thank you for joining us. And I hope that you really get a lot of pleasure out of today. I think I will. So I'm going to hand it over to John, and I will see you guys all soon.
Great, thank you, Nancy, so much. And I just want to thank everyone for coming. We had so many people sign up for this, and I will let everyone know too that we are recording this session, especially for those that wanted to join, that this time period doesn't quite fit into scheduling on the other side of the world. And I'm going to just make a note right now before I give additional thanks that we're having a little trouble hearing our first speaker, and they're having trouble hearing us. So we may have to vamp a little to get to 1:30. And my idea, if we aren't able to make that first speaker happen, because as Nancy said, we have a truly international cohort here, which we're super excited to try to facilitate, is that maybe Nancy and I can take some questions about the society in general, about joining the society, about our work with the society. I think that might be one way to give some value to the first 15 minutes that we might not be able to get if we can't get Gail's connection to work, as often sometimes happens with our new online world. So let me first, I'll introduce myself. So I'm John Della Parra. I am on the Council for the Society for Economic Botany. I've been involved with the society for many years, and it has been my professional home for all of those years. I started as a student member, and so for those of you that are students listening now, we encourage you to join the society. It's a great place to get started and meet the people that are doing the things that you might want to do one day. So if you're interested in ethnobotany, if you're interested in how people and plants interact, it's a home for you. We do everything from anthropology to chemistry and everything in between at the society, and the membership has been represented by that, and so have members of the council. So we really encourage anyone who's interested to please join the society. You can go to www.econbot.org, and in the upper right hand corner there's a button that says join. So we'd love to have you, and we hopefully will have a live in-person meeting next summer in Jamaica. That's the plan, in the summer of 2021. If because of the virus we still can't have that, we will probably push it again to the next year, but we will have, at some point we will meet each other in person again. In the meantime, this is our first real chance to see what an online symposium can be like. So this is our first test, warts and all. So as we might see, hopefully we can get the first speaker up and running. I also want to iterate Heather, the thanks that Nancy gave to Heather Kakaninden and Amelia Neely. The BSA office has been instrumental. We couldn't do any of the technical aspects of this without them. And also the representatives from the student committee, Karsten Furter and Lucas Paura, who helped me review all the amazing abstracts that we got. So if you're an attendee and maybe you submitted an abstract and you weren't selected to be a part of this symposium, I hope you don't take it too harshly. We had so many amazing applicants. We had many, many more than we are able to bring on board, and we wanted to have representation from around the world. We wanted to have representation from different disciplines, but there will be a place for you in the future, hopefully, and hopefully we can have another one of these in the future. I'm going to take one moment to see if I can hear our first speaker. Gail, can you hear us? It seems her connection might be a little slow. Can you hear us, Gail? So Gail is joining us from Burundi, which is, a first for the Society for Economic Botany, right? To have a live presentation from Burundi. And we're really hoping that we could kick it off. We do have many other international speakers who I know can hear me and I can hear them. And let me just pull up the agenda real quick. And I see some people asking about the agenda. We're gonna fill just a little bit of time here since our first speaker is having some communication problems. So we will try to start a little bit before 1:30 with our next speaker, unless we're able to get Gail's connection fixed. So I'm just going to pull up the agenda. So At 1:30, our first speaker, if we can't get Gail's connection fixed, will be Lily Zeitler from World Agroforestry. I believe headquartered also in Africa, in Nairobi, Kenya. So we hope to still have representation there. Okay, Nancy, why don't we, so I'm not just droning on, why don't we see if we have any questions from the audience about the Society for Economic Botany, if you have ideas about future things that we can do to engage everyone now, or anything else that you might want to know about the Society. So I see someone has already asked, is there some possibility to submit a new abstract for the event next year? Absolutely. So we don't know yet if there will be, what it will look like. Maybe this person is talking about the in-person event. Yes. So we will have a process that usually starts probably in the spring or even late winter for accepting abstracts for the in-person event that we have every year, the annual Society for Economic Botany conference. Oh wait, I'm getting a message here. So Gail's supervisor says they can present their talk. So let me make Aida Cuni Sanchez. Whoops, I'm gonna make you, I think I can make you a, just give me 1 second, allowed to talk. Aida, can you hear us? You've been unmuted, or I'm gonna ask you to unmute.
Hi.
Oh,
Yes,
hi, Aida. Perfect. Okay.
Sorry.
You may have rescued us for the very first chat, the very first talk in the very
I'm
first
so
online
sorry
symposium.
because we just practiced that with her an hour ago. I don't know.
Great. Oh, whoops. Can you hear us, Aida? Oh, Gail, can you hear us?
Yes.
Okay. Yes, you can hear us. Perfect. Gail, do you want to share your screen and we can see if we can get this started?
Sorry, 1 second. I think when you made me co-host, the thing
Oh yeah,
went
kick you off.
crazy.
Oh, well, this is wonderful news. Okay, despite our efforts to vamp, it seems that we have gotten Gail started. So, and Gail, I don't,
hi, Gail.
yeah, I don't know if Gail's, hopefully you can hear us and we can hear you. There seems to be maybe some slight delay, but we do have, we have about 1 minute before your talk is scheduled, but I think maybe we can kick things off now and make sure everything runs smoothly. So I'm going to turn it over to our first speaker, Gail. Gail? Aida, can you hear us?
Yes. Let me just try one thing. Gael, if you can hear me, there's a mute button on the bottom of the screen. I don't know if you click that one. Just unclick it in case that was the problem.
Otherwise, Aida, you said you would be able to present this.
Yes, I can do that, but let's give her 1 minute, sorry, just to try after we practice so much.
Can I start to?
Oh, yes, we can hear you now, Gail. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to express myself about our research on local perceptions of forest ecosystem services in sites from Burundi. Firstly, I want to explain what is ecosystem services. According to the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, the ecosystem services are the benefits provided by ecosystems to humans, which contribute to making human life both possible and worth living. And these services can be divided in 4 categories. We can see the provisioning services, for example, food, the regulating services, for example, the regulation of microclimate, and the supporting services, for example, soil formation, and finally, the cultural services, for example, the recreation.
there are several different approaches that in which we can value the ecosystem services. We have the ecological approach, the economic, and the socio-cultural approach, which is gaining in importance actually, and it applies research methods from the social sciences, value ecosystem services in non-monetary terms, and explicitly make the stakeholders the focal point of the research. This approach has some advantages. We can value cultural services. We can understand the complex socio-ecological systems, assure social relevance of the ecosystem services assessment, and finally strengthen the policy relevance of the assessment. There are some reasons why the stakeholders can value the ecosystem services differently, like the social context, the personal characteristics, for example, the gender or the income, and the interactions between stakeholders and the ecosystem services. In our research, we focus on we want to show that the local community depend on provisioning ecosystem services, and the effects of culture on ecosystem services identification, definition, and valuing, and the effects of culture on preferred plant species. For the methodology, we held focus group discussions with the village elders from two different ethnic groups, the farmers and the Twa gatherers around the Kibera National Park, and
Gail, I'm sorry, it sounds like your feed is breaking up. You might want to try turning off your video if all possible, because we can't hear you right now. Oh, it seems like we might have lost her. Aida, are you still there?
Yes.
Okay, I have Gail's presentation if we want to pick it up, just because in the interest of time.
Yeah, sure. You can pick it up where it was, and
yes.
I can just continue.
Just give me 1 second and I will share her presentation. Apologies to the audience for these minor inconveniences. Okay, can you can see this, Aida?
Yes. So if you go down to slide, where we were. So the study focused on the local communities and how culture affects the identification of ecosystem services from the forest, and also on which are the preferred plant species for different uses like firewood, medicine, wild fruits, and wild vegetables. So the way the study was organized is that there was focus group discussions with elders from two groups, the farmers, in this case it includes Tutsi and Hutu, and the Twa hunter-gatherers. Just to clarify a little bit, the Twa are the hunter-gatherers that have no land and they don't do farming. So they still enter the forest on nearly a daily basis. So the idea was to see how different they are using the forest and how often and so on. So we also collected plant samples that were identified at the herbarium of the University of Burundi, and some of them at the herbarium of maize in Belgium. And you can see Burundi, which is in Central Africa in the Albertine Rift region. So you can go to the next one. John, if that's okay.
Yes, it's not advancing. There we go.
Okay, so the study area was the communities around Kibera National Park, which has a surface of 40,000 hectares, and it's a wet mountain forest. You can see some of the dominant species, which are typical from mountain forests in Africa, including the African bamboo. And it should be noted that this mountain forest was degraded and part of it deforested during the civil war of Burundi, which was quite long. And it's still going on at the moment. So deforestation is no longer an issue, but there's still issues of degradation, although this is a national park. So if you want to go to the next one, John. So a little bit on the results. So there were important differences on the forest ecosystem service identified by the farmers and by the Twa hunter-gatherers. So some ecosystem services were mentioned by both groups, like firewood or medicine, for example, or water from the forest, but there were some differences, and these are quite linked to the livelihood strategy. So for example, the Twa were the only ones that were using herbs and clay from the forest to make pottery, and then they sell this pottery to buy food, as they're not farming, as I said. They also mentioned their identity link with the forest. And the farmers mentioned, for example, pest control thanks to the forest and soil formation, which is quite linked to their livelihood strategy, which is farming. And also it was important to see what they identified as the first, second, and third most important ecosystem services. So for the Twa, it was firewood, because they sell firewood to buy food. And the second most important was wild vegetables, because they rely on these wild vegetables for food security. While for the farmers, they mentioned microclimate regulation, which actually they mentioned the forests attract the rains, and the rains are important for our crops because they are farmers. So if you want to go to the next one, John, I'm trying to go a little bit fast. So it was important to know the difference in place attachment with the forest between these two groups. And place attachment can be defined as the emotional bond between a person and a place. And I usually give the example of a tree. So in a way, if we care about ethnobotany, we care about trees and about forests. But it's different if they cut a tree in the middle of nowhere, far away from our home, or if they cut the only tree in our garden, for example, where we grow up or where our children are playing. So it takes another dimension. So it's just to exemplify how we can be connected to nature in different ways, but also to nature in a specific place. So the next one, John. So we looked at how different aspects of place attachment were related to the comments made by the people we interviewed. So we found out that farmers mentioned that the forest was important for their food security and their health, especially when crops fail, they turn to forests for wild fruits and vegetables. But the Twa mentioned many more aspects, of the forest, of place attachment with the forest. For example, the link to their cultural identity, and they call it home. And it was also very important for their physical security. They felt safe at home in the forest, not outside. So for example, if you go to next slide, John, I like to quote one of their comments, which is the cultural identity is the third one here, that say, we can bear to live far from the forest, we must at least see our home. This means because the Twa were evicted from the national park, so they live outside and they enter all the time. So what they say is that even if they're no longer allowed to live inside, they have to at least see it because that's their home. That's how they feel, how attached they feel to it. That is the comment. And we also found differences in the preferred plant species for the different uses, for firewood, for medicine, for edible fruits and vegetables. And the article was recently published in Ecosystem Service led by Gael. So you can see more about it. And if somebody doesn't have access to this journal, you can send an email to Gael, which her email is the next slide. And that's it. So Gael led the work, and these are some photos from the fieldwork with the elders she was interviewing and collecting plants in the forest. And the first forest, you can see this very sharp divide between the national park. You can see this line of where the forest starts and where the cultivation plots start from the farmers. So it's a very particular landscape in this. Only forest is left is in protected areas in Burundi, or most of it. And that is it. And thanks. And sorry for the internet connection. I mean, just to highlight again, I mean, internet is not the best in Burundi. So we practiced a few times with her and it always worked. I'm kind of sorry that it didn't work tonight. So sorry about it, guys. But you can always drop her an email or you can also drop me an email. I mean, I can put it in the chat box if you want to know more about our work.
Well, Aida, thank you so much for that.
No worries.
Really fascinating talk, and you picked it up perfectly. And hopefully, we've all learned something about our global interconnectedness and how sometimes it isn't as reliable as we expect it to be, and we have to make do as our world is changing for the people that you're studying as well.
Yes.
We do have a few minutes for questions. About 3 or 4 minutes. So Aida, if you would like to take questions, we can
sure.
we can open it up to anyone that would like to. So the way that we want to do that, I'm going to stop sharing now, is that if you can raise your hand. So I believe you do that by Heather. How do they do that?
There's a little hand button in the bottom of the screen that they can raise their hand, and usually people can also write the question in the chat box. Am I correct, John? That's how we done it.
It might be hard for me. The chat is scrolling pretty quickly, so it's easier if they raise their hand, and then I'll unmute you. So anyone with a question? Okay, I see someone. I'm just trying to find the hand that was raised. Okay, great. Okay, so we have Joseph Nguta. I'm going to allow you to talk, so you can go ahead and ask your question.
Oh, thank you for that presentation. How easy was it interacting with these people and the revelation of information by these people, especially in regard to the important plant species that they use to treat different diseases?
I think the first, how easy, I mean, it depends what you consider easy. I mean, I work in different areas, and it always depends on the time you spend with the people and the trust that you build. So Gael is herself from Burundi. The professor, he's also in the chat, I think, Jax, he's also in Burundi. So I think they've been working in the national park for a while. So to a certain extent, they kind of know the community, so that helps build trust when you ask certain questions. And here, I think asking about medicinal plants in Burundi is not taboo, so people are quite open to talk about it and discuss about it. And we are actually currently working on a list of some of the plants. Most of the plants they use are not of conservation concern. There are some that are of conservation concern. So we are trying to figure out which are being harvested more often. But in general, it's quite open. I mean, it would be harder if we were to discuss about bushmeat and wild animals. There's a little bit more pressure on that. But at least here, talking about medicinal plants is kind of relatively easy. I mean, once you build the trust and they know you are not from like a commercial company or something dodgy like that. So I hope that helped.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Aida. I don't see any other hands right now, and we're pushing up to our next speaker. So we're going to thank you, Aida and Gael. We're very sorry you weren't able to give your entire presentation, but your research is well appreciated, and it was very, very compelling. So thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thank you, Aida. Okay, I'm going to very quickly, I didn't get a chance to do this, but I'm going to share the agenda for everyone because I don't think we got a chance to do that. So perhaps you can see my screen now. So we had Gail from Burundi, Lily Zeitler will be next, Vartika Jain at 1:45, Nicolas Gerard at 2 o'clock, Fernando Lopez Anito at 2:15, Aurora Pren at 2:30. And then we'll have a 30-minute break. So most of these speakers will be because of time constraints, because of time differences. And then we'll move to North American colleagues at 3:15, 3:30, 3:45, 4:15, and 4:30. And then we'll wrap up around 4:45 with some closing comments. Okay, great. So let's move on to Lily.
Hi, hey.
Yeah, and feel free to introduce yourself first and then begin. Thanks.
Yeah, my introduction's in the presentation. Perfect. So shall I go ahead?
Yes, go ahead.
Great, okay. Okay. Okay, can everybody see that?
Yes, you're good.
Great. Okay, so hello, good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on wherever you are. My name's Lily Zeitler, and it's such an honor to be speaking to so many phenomenal ethnobotanists doing such inspiring work. In this presentation, I'd like to dive into the role of culture in shaping plant use, specifically in a single village in Northwest Thailand, but then zooming out to see how these findings relate to broader socio-political processes and ethnobotanical debates. So the village I'm referring to is Nam Hu, and in the study area map, you can see that it's in Northwest Thailand on the border with Myanmar. And in the satellite image of the village, you can see 3 circles, each representing a different ethnic group. The blue are the Shan, the red are the Lisu, and they're separated by about 500 meters. And the yellow is a Chinese village, which unfortunately I didn't have time or funding to include in this analysis. So you can see there's a great ethnic diversity on a gradient in very close proximity. And with the surrounding photos, I just want to illustrate why Nam Hu is so interesting for an ethnobotanist. You can see a typical market stall and a typical home garden, both full of medicinal plants. And on the right, you can see that there's not just great ethnic diversity, but religious diversity as well, with subpopulations of Buddhists and Christians in both ethnic groups. So my personal connection with this study area dates back to when I was 19 years old in this bamboo hut on the outskirts of the village, trying to escape the modern world and live a carbon neutral life. And I was inspired by my neighbors like Lungching, pictured here, and their extensive knowledge of the natural world, which actually got me into ethnobotany. So I returned to the village during my ethnobotany master's, armed with the theoretical and practical knowledge to systematically document local plant use and test hypotheses. And I decided to frame my hypothesis in relation to Philip and Gentry's seminal 1993 paper outlining the plant use hypothesis and index. And in their original formulation, cultural determinants weren't included, and plant use was attributed to ecology and phylogeny. And this work aims to build upon the growing body of evidence on the role of culture in plant use and position culture as a major player. And where better than in my old home Nam Hu, where the close proximity of religious and ethnic groups ensures that the surrounding ecology is shared. So inter and intra-group variation can then largely be explained by non-environmental cultural factors. And stratified sampling of different gender, ethnic, and religious subgroups facilitated this comparison. I also opted for a participatory approach. The Lisu are very protective of their medicinal plant knowledge and not trusting of outsiders. I built up rapport by hanging out in the village church that doubled as a children's home for disadvantaged Lisu kids. And Supakrit, the pastor, who you can see on the top left, really became invaluable to the project, and I couldn't have done it without him. And together we compiled plant books to return to the local community. And the nice thing about this collaboration was that the Lisu translation budget could then go directly to the children's home to support the kids that you see cheering up at the top. I also opted for a mixed methods approach using both quantitative and qualitative approaches. And the quantitative methods are outlined in this table. So in interviews, I collected free lists of medicinal plants used, as well as ailments treated. And I later asked about the plant organ, application, and source to be compiled into a use report. And the use report served as the basis for 2 separate strains of analysis. They were first aggregated into disease clusters based on Cook's standards and used to calculate informant consensus factors. And then second, they were also further processed into a dichotomized positive match informant use matrix. And this matrix was the input for a principal component analysis and factor analysis of mixed data. Now, I don't want to bore you with lots of charts and graphs, of which there's a thesis full. Let it suffice to say that the 38 informants reported using 273 different taxa in 1,204 different use reports. And 101 of those plants were identified to the species level, and 90 specimen vouchers were collected. But I'd really just like to hone in on the main message, and that was that plant use diverged most strongly by ethnicity, followed by religion, whereas gender was not a strong explanatory variable, as you can see in these principal component plots. And these results were confirmed by the factor analysis of mixed data. And you can see the strong divergence between ethnicity, less strong divergence, but still distinct between religious groups, and then not very apparent for gender. Now, I know the anthropologists in the audience are thinking, nice graphs, but what about the qualitative results? And that's where it gets really interesting. The qualitative results contextualized the numbers and gave them meaning. And what kept cropping up in interviews with the Lisu was a recurring life history or narrative. Most Lisu I interviewed used to farm opium in remote forested hills, far from any healthcare services. But the opium bans and government crackdown in the 1980s instigated a breakdown of the highland economy, pushing Lisu people out of their highland homes and towards villages in the valley. Now, it's important to recognize that in those former highland contexts, childbirth was one of the most life-threatening experiences. And over time, the Lisu developed a complex ethnomedical system for postpartum recovery, involving strict observance of sauna rituals. Informants reported using 20 to 50 different medicinal plants in their saunas, administered in 3 treatments after childbirth. And one could argue that the Lisu preference for the sauna might originate from the environment of their former highland home with higher altitudes and colder climates, bringing us back to that old environment versus culture debate and whether that's even a fair dichotomy. But it is worth noting that even though the Lisu in Namhu now have access to modern healthcare facilities, their postpartum customs remain rooted in their highland culture of health and healing. And even young Lisu women that live and work in the urban centers return to the villages for their postpartum sauna treatment, which is usually administered by close relatives. And the sauna evolves into this social gathering, fostering social cohesion and solidarity. And the postpartum sauna thereby acts as a vehicle for the transmission and preservation of Lisu cultural identity. Now, the Lisu postpartum ethnomedical traditions extend beyond the sauna to differing symbolic conceptualizations of illness. And during my interviews with the Lisu, I kept stumbling across this phenomenon of water illness. And I was like, what is this water illness? I've never heard of this. And water illness arises from transgressions of taboos surrounding water. Prohibitions, particularly for pregnant women, new mothers, and young children, entail refraining from contact with cold water at certain times. Symptoms are exhaustion, fatigue, and physical pain. Now, I really struggled with the concept of water illness since it's so far removed from any biomedical understandings that we're familiar with. And arguably my inability to conceive of the biological reality of water illness might be what Lienhardt refers to as the limited conceptual toolkit of the anthropologist. And I'd like to return to that issue in just a few slides. But first, I feel like I've been unfair to the Shan, focusing so much on the Lisu. And the Shan are in a completely different situation than the Lisu. The Shan live in Myanmar and along the border, where they face decades of persecution by Myanmar's military regime. Many Shan flee and settle in Thailand, and many fight for years in the jungle with the Shan Resistance Army, often relying on plants to treat injuries. This might be why analgesics were the most reported use for medicinal plants among the Shan. Postpartum recovery was a close second, and the plants in the slide above are used for postpartum recovery using an ingestion and boiling and bathing application. And the wood on the left is Tanaka, or Hesperithusa crenulata, known more commonly as an iconic cosmetic in Myanmar. And the Shan even returned to Myanmar to obtain high-grade Tanaka for postpartum recovery. So migration, political ecology, and personal histories continue to shape plant preferences in the study area for both the Shan and the Lisu. Now, I've been focusing a lot on ethnicity, and I just want to briefly touch upon religious differences as well. And the most obvious difference that I could sense was mainly with my taste buds. And that was that the Buddhists liked their medicine in alcoholic form, which Christians thought would be a gateway for bad spirits. And of course, as a good scientist, I had to remain objective by trying everything. And you can see I did my best to live up to the student stereotype by drinking alcohol. And usually this medicinal liquor came in some sort of soda bottle with less than medicinal looking labels. But looks are deceiving, since these usually contained between 20 to 40 different medicinal plants. Briefly worth mentioning is also the historical ecology of religion in the region, which involves Buddhist monks developing Chinese traditional medicine and traveling to share their knowledge. And many informants in the study area related plant use to balancing the Chinese elements of fire and water, and also that they would obtain medicinal plants from the Chinese village next door. So that was kind of an underlying cultural current for both the Shan and the Lisu. Aside from medicinal alcohol, I also noticed that many plants were falling into the gray zones of plant use. Informants cited plants used in rituals and prayers for health. And within the local ethnomedical system, these are absolutely vital for maintaining health, while Westerners might see them as superstitions. And standards are set by Westerners based on clinical and biomedical understandings, and they're inherently biased. And this raises ethical issues for researchers attempting to best represent their informants' holistic visions of healing. A disease classification system of great plasticity, breaking barriers of assumed mind-body dichotomies, is needed to account for the plethora of local biologies confronting ethnobotanical and ethnomedical researchers in the field. Through successive waves of migration from different regions, Namhu has become a cultural melting pot, with Shan, Lisu, Thai, and Chinese ethnic groups residing within a shared space. Despite great political and social upheavals, transboundary migrations, persecution, socioeconomic marginalization, and the saturation of the medical market with subsidized biomedicine, essential cultural customs and practices continue to thrive, such as the postpartum sauna among Lisu and the use of Tanaka among Tayai. Despite signs of intergenerational knowledge erosion, elements of Lisu and Shan culture remain resilient in the face of change, with plant use acting as a vehicle and expression of cultural identity. Now, I think my time's up, but I just want to quickly make a quick pitch, and that is that and ask for your input, because I'm struggling to publish this work, and hopefully after this presentation, you also think it's worthy of publication. But I've been advised that with low identification rates, it's not publishable. And many of the unidentified plants are located deep in protected forests where it's illegal to collect. So I don't know how to get around this issue. Maybe someone listening has some ideas. Thank you so much for your attention, and I look forward to future discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lily. Yeah. Wonderful. If anyone has any questions or wants to respond to Lily's question, please raise your hand and I will unmute you. Okay, no questions. No advice for Lily.
Please.
Well, if there, oh wait, okay, we got one from my friend Brandon Dale. Let's talk. Hi, Brandon.
Hey, John. Hi, Lily. Great talk. I actually have a question, and it's not advice. That's a really difficult issue. It sounds like you're working against, and I wish you the best of luck. But I was wondering if you could speak about the kind of role and interaction between the biomedical clinicians who were there, kind of interacting with these communities. And I know that you mentioned that there are lots of cultural practices and even medicinal practices that are still being utilized with the regards to plant usage. And so I'm wondering what the kind of interface was like between biomedical clinicians and the community members who were still utilizing traditional healing methods.
So with biomedical clinicians, do you mean those in the local hospitals?
Correct, yeah.
Yeah, so Thailand has this subsidized, subsidized hospitals. So if you're a low income earner, then you can go to the hospital and just pay 30 baht for a treatment, which is like about $1. So there is this financial incentive to go seek Western medicines. And that's why I think, and of course, you know, when a Lisu woman is pregnant, she will go for antenatal care in the hospital if she is living in the valley and not still up in the highlands. And that's why I think it's even more remarkable that despite having that access and having affordable access to healthcare, they still prefer having these, or still maintain these postpartum cultural traditions with plants, and going to great trouble and pains to get these plants. I mean, it often involves, it's 20 to 50 different plants per sauna. And often, the Lisu, they say that the really strong medicinal plants, they're deep in the forest, and only the weak medicinal plants are in the valley. So they really have this strong preference for the plants in the forest, and they will walk for days to get them. So even despite all that inconvenience and the access to modern healthcare, they still maintain those traditions.
Great, thank you,
So
Lily.
yeah, so I think they go hand in hand, basically. They go in parallel.
Perfect, thank you so much. Great
Yeah,
question, great answer. Okay, we're gonna move to the next speaker. Thank you so much, Lily. So our next speaker is Vartika Jain, who joins us from India. Hi, Vartika.
Hello, namaskar. Greetings from India. I would like to share my screen.
Sure.
So, first of all, I would like to thank Society for Economic Botany for giving me the opportunity to present my work here in this symposium. And today I would like to present about sweets as traditional medicine in winter season, an ethnobotanical study in Udaipur city, India. So sweets possess an essential role in Indian diet. Usually they are consumed at the end of the meals. And there exists a wide variability among the sweets all over the country. And interestingly, there are various plants and plant parts which are used for preparing many of these sweets. And being a resident of Udaipur city from last 38 years, I observed that winter season is generally considered for building immunity by doing some dietary modifications and taking some particular winter sweets, which are known as sardiyon ki khurak in local language here. But till now, there was no scientific documentation of the diversity of the sweets and the traditional knowledge regarding those sweets, and therefore the study has been undertaken. So this is the map of the study area, and Udaipur city, it is situated in South Rajasthan, in the western part of the India. It is known as City of Lakes, and winter exists for their 4 months, particularly from October to January, and therefore the ethnobotanical surveys were carried out for those 4 months in 2018, to particularly to 11 popular sweet selling shops of Udaipur city, and semi-structured interviews were conducted from shopkeepers as well as from consumers, and mainly following information was obtained from the consumers. What are the particular sweets which are being consumed in the winter season? What are the reasons behind their consumption? Which sweets are prepared at home? Which are prepared, purchased from the shops? What are any health benefits which are associated with this? And all those interviews, they were conducted in the local language, particularly in Hindi. And besides that, keen personal observations were also made on the sweets which were displayed in the local fairs and various feasts. Then photographs of the sweets were also taken after obtaining the consent. Then taxonomic identification of the plants which are used in preparing these winter sweets was carried out by consulting the standard appropriate literature. So this is the list of 11 traditional sweet shops which were surveyed in the Udaipur city. And now coming to the results. First about the plants, 36 angiospermic plant species belonging to 21 families, they are being used to prepare these winter seeds. And Leguminosae dominates the list with 6 plants, followed by Poaceae with 4, and Anacardiaceae and Gingiberaceae each with 3 plant species. And there were 23 cultivated plant species, and 13 were imported outside of the Rajasthan state. And they were mainly the spices, few of the spices, and the dry fruits. And seeds were the most frequently utilized plant part, followed by fruits and roots and gum. So the plants were being used in these sweets either as a major ingredient or for garnishing purpose or for flavoring purpose. And wheat was one of the major ingredients in most of the sweets, besides almonds and cardamom powder. And cane sugar and the jaggery, which was obtained from Saccharum officinarum, it is the main nutritive sweetener which was in all these winter sweets. So this is the list of all those 36 plant species and their botanical name, families, local name, common name, and plant part used. Now coming about the sweets, The 40 different type of winter sweets are being used in the winter season in Udaipur city, and I have categorized them under these laddus, barfi, halwa, kheer, quiche, and milk sweets, and then other kind of sweets. I'm going to show you photographs of these sweets in the next few slides. Now, first about the reasons. There were many reasons for purchasing the sweets from the shops. One of them was good taste, and the other were the prophylactic or curative some health benefits. Then it was also indicating high financial status because as sweets are very costlier. Then lack of time for making sweets at home. Then difficulty of preparing sweets at home. It also compelled people to purchase the sweets from shops. And then there were some personal preferences for cost, purity, taste, and freshness, which compelled people to purchase the sweets from the shops. Then these are the main sweets which were used for some health benefits, particularly in the conditions like arthritis, joint pain, asthma, cold and cough, and building immunity. And they were also very good in taste. Now, these are the sweets which are also available throughout the year, but they are preferred in winter season due to the better digestion capacity of the stomach. Then these are the sweets which are available throughout the year, but they are preferred in winter season for good taste as well as for good satiating capacity. Then, interestingly, there were some sweets which are exclusively made at the home. These are just like Lauki ka halwa, shakarkand ka halwa, doodh ka quiche. And then some sweets are exclusively available in the shops and feasts, and they were never prepared at the home. These are like Alwar Pak, this Tarfini, Imarti, Gevar. And some sweets were exclusively available at shops. They are never prepared at homes. These are like Gazak, Revdi, Rajgira ka laddu. Now, these sweets were not only diverse in their names, but also in their ingredients, their taste, consistency, their shelf life, their methods of preparation, and even in their shapes. So the most common shapes were triangle shaped and these diamond shaped barfis or chakkis. Then the second one was the round ball shaped, these laddus. And then there was concentric rings of these jalebi, circular disc of this gaver, the oblong oval shaped this cham cham, and then so on. So these 7 kinds of laddus were being used in the winter season in Udaipur city. They are prepared from the black gram, fenugreek, dry fruits, sesame seeds, Indian gooseberry, amaranth. Then these barfis, they are square or diamond shaped solid pieces. They are made either from the cashew nuts, some other mixed nuts, ginger barfi, fig, from the corn, from the gram, and then halwa. It's a very special dish of winter season. It is semi-solid in consistency. It is rich in the pure clarified butter fat. And these 8 types of halwas, they are being used in the winter season. They are made either from Triticum sativum, that is our wheat, green gram, almond halwa, walnut halwa made from poppy seeds, carrots, bottle gourd, sweet potato. And there were some milk sweets. These are like kheer. They are having semi-liquid consistency. First one is the Chawalgi Kheer made from rice. Then Makhani ki Kheer, which is made from foxnut seeds, and it is particularly recommended for treatment of arthritis. Then other one is the Doodh ka Quiche. It is made from wheat and milk, and particularly this is made on the Makar Sankranti festival, which occurs in the mid-January season every year. Then hot milk is generally considered very good in the winter season for making the body heat. So the kesar ka doodh, it is prepared from the crocus sativus. It is specially recommended to make the body with heat and with energy. Then other one is the khajur milk. It is prepared from the fruits of Phoenix dactylifera, and it is recommended for the persons having asthma. Then lapsi, it's a traditional Rajasthani sweet dish. It is prepared from wheat, jaggery, various dry fruits, nuts, and usually it is prepared at home, and it is prepared at any auspicious occasion or any festival and offered to deities for worship before consuming this sweet. Then I'm going to highlight here some of the potential health benefits of the plant-based sweets in the winter season. I observed that the gum of plant Acacia nilotica and Anagesis latifolia is being used. They are known as babul ka gund or dhavdi ka gund in local language, and they are being used to prepare urad dal laddu, gund ka laddu, kardan pak, and sot ki barfi, and it is considered very good for treatment of weakness, back pain, and joint pain. Then Trigonella phenum gracium seeds, they are known as methi or fenugreek seeds. They are used to prepare methi ka laddu, and this is especially recommended for arthritis, back pain, rheumatism, and joint pain. And generally, these conditions they raises during the winter season, as we know, and even scientifically also the anti-inflammatory immunomodulatory properties of this Trigonella seeds have been already established. Then Cesium seeds, they are known as tilli, and they are used to prepare tilli ka laddu, this ravari, and this gajak. And these are also recommended for treatment of gout and rheumatism. And its anti-inflammatory property and vasorelaxant activities have already been established. Then Phyllanthus amblica fruits. These are Indian gooseberry, amla, and they are prepared as amla candy, and these are amla laddus, and these amla laddus are used for increasing immunity. They are recommended for taking for 1 or 2 months daily, and as we know that Phyllanthus amblicus has shown very health beneficial activities, just like vasodilatation, which is very important during the winter season. Then Coccus nucifera, its dried endosperm, is known as copra or gola in the local language, and it is used as in the various sweets like dry fruit laddu, gud ki lapsi, and it has also shown various health beneficial properties. Then nuts are very essential part of many of the sweets. I have noted down the seeds in which these nuts are used. These are almonds, cashew nuts, walnuts, raisins, pistachio, peanuts, and maximum use of almonds was observed, which is rich in various minerals, vitamins, and it is also shown to reduce the cholesterol and various other bad cholesterol levels. Walnuts have also shown hypolipidemic activity. Then even another one study has shown that these nuts improve cardiovascular risk factors and also improve mental health and bone mineral density. So therefore, the incorporation of these nuts in these sweets, it indirectly supports the wisdom of the traditional local people of Udaipur city. And another thing I would like to highlight here is that these sweets are rich in fat content, and all those fat-induced alterations in the lipid parameters of the body can be managed by incorporation of these nuts. So it is very important because of their lipid lowering potential. So there were many other spices which are also used in these sweets, just like small cardamom, it was maximally used, then greater cardamom, saffron, black pepper, nutmeg and mace, and all over the world, the scientific studies have shown that they're very health beneficial activities like anti-inflammatory, and they can also neutralize fat-induced alterations, the fibrinolysis. And one of the important thing about small cardamom is that it can reduce the blood pressure. And as we know that in winter season, blood pressure generally raises. So it is very useful to add this cardamom powder in these sweets. Then rhizome of Zingiber officinale, it is dried and it is known as sot, and it is used to prepare sot ki barfi. And this is particularly recommended for treatment of joint pain and arthritis. And scientifically also its anti-inflammatory and anti-arthritic potential have been identified. Then Papaver somniferum seeds, known as poppy seeds, it is used to prepare khaskhas ka halwa, kardan pak, and gajar ka halwa. And particularly this khaskhas ka halwa is recommended to be taken during intense cold environment in the season of December for 3 days regularly for building immunity power. Then amaranth seeds, they are locally known as rajgira, and these are used to prepare rajgira ke laddus, which are especially used during fasting days, which occurs in Navratri festival, usually in October month. And it is a nutritious pseudo cereal having various minerals, vitamins, and it is also shown to decrease cholesterol levels and also stimulating immune system and conditions of hypertension. Then, as I have told that the sugarcane is the basic sweetener behind all these sweets, and either in the form of cane sugar or in the form of jaggery. But jaggery is traditionally considered better over all the white sugar, and in many of the sweets, jaggery was used. It's a traditional nutritive sweetener, and it is mentioned even in the ancient texts such as Rig Veda, and it is considered to be having 50 times more mineral content. But however, consumers were not aware about all these scientific evidences for these health beneficial properties of these traditional winter sweets. They are just observing that their elder family members are taking these sweets every year and they are just experiencing these health benefits. But this nutritional and pharmacological profile of these plant, some of these plant species, it further indirectly supports the observation of those elderly people. So to conclude here, that this is the first study to document various types of winter sweets and the botanical knowledge related with these sweets, and it highlights the importance of the traditional health practices, which should be documented as soon as possible. And these are the particular sweets which are used for the treatment of joint pain, arthritis, rheumatism, asthma. So these are the directly told recommended for these, but there are some other indirect evidences, as I've already told, that they can help in reduction of blood pressure, in prevention of cardiovascular diseases, increasing immunity. So these traditional recipes, they can act as a wonderful nutraceuticals by not only providing nutrition, but providing also some very health benefits. But however, this detailed nutritional and clinical assessment of all these winter seeds in their original form should be carried out so that we can project them as a winter sweets in the nutraceutical in the modern markets. And furthermore, the cultivation of these plant resources at the large scale in the local area, it can also help in socioeconomic enhancement of the local communities. So that the philosophy of your medicine should be your food and your food should be your medicine is practically being implemented by the local people of Udaipur city. So it is from this traditional knowledge we can get so many nutraceutical products for our health. So stay healthy with all these traditional recipes. And this study has been recently published in Ethnobotany Research and Applications for your kind reference. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Jain. That was very unique and fascinating work, and I'm so glad that we got the opportunity to hear all about that. We're over time a little, but there is one raised hand, so I'll ask that we keep it very short, but I'll allow Omari to ask a question. Omari, you are unmuted. Okay, maybe we can't hear you. So unfortunately, we're going to move on to the next speaker. But thank you so much, Dr. Jain, and I'm sure if there are other questions, then people will be able to reach out to you. All right, thanks so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, our next speaker is Nicola. Nicola, feel free to share your screen and introduce yourself. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, John. Can you see?
Yes, sorry, I was muted. Yeah, but it's not full screen yet. Oh, there it goes. Perfect.
Cool. Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here today and be able to present my research. So just before getting into the presentation, for the past 2 years, I've been studying agroecology, focusing on biocultural diversity and traditional food waste. So I was lucky enough to integrate the Nordic People and Plants project. It's a joint project that is interdisciplinary and led by the Natural and Cultural History Museum of Oslo. So it's also a collaborative project. And at the beginning of my study, we discussed together with the Norwegian Association of Mycology and Foraging our respective needs and objectives, and they wanted to develop guidelines of sustainable foraging in this context of new Nordic food movements. So my mission was to explore to what extent the foraging of wild edible plants is a sustainable activity in Norway. So I had 3 main study objectives. The first one was to study and explore the socio-ecological context of the foraging activity in Norway. So I wanted to answer the research question of who forage and what is being foraged. The second objective was on the investigation of motivations, practices, and perceptions. And I specifically wanted to answer the research question, why people forage, how they do it, and how do they feel about it? What is the perceived impact they have on biodiversity? The third objective was on the exploration of interactions and influences, specifically looking at the market influence and how the new Nordic food movements promote the use of wild edible plants and the foraging activity. And the final objective was to assess the impact and to answer the main study problem. So to that end, I had 3 main hypotheses. The first one was on the foraging and plant relation, and I assumed that specific kind of foraging modes would affect the biodiversity. For example, plants from which the roots would be collected would be more vulnerable than others. The second hypothesis was on the relation between foraging and foragers, and I assumed that different socio-cultural constructs, for example, being a professional forager or a non-professional one, would have different foraging attitudes on the field. The third hypothesis was on the foraging and market interaction, and I specifically wanted to look at how the market influenced the foraging activity, and I assume that new Nordic cuisine promotes and affect the foraging activity in some way. So now, how did I do? I used a participatory framework, and I went on the field doing some ethnography with professional foragers, and we delivered to a few restaurants, had the chance to talk to different chefs. I also submitted an online questionnaire, and I got 219 responses. And I interviewed 19 key stakeholders, from professional to non-professionals, also chefs and conservationists. So now, what about the main findings? Who forage? I found that overall, the Norwegian foraging activity is driven in Norway mainly by non-professional. So 95% of my online questionnaire respondents were non-professional foragers, and 60% of them were members of a foraging society. The remaining 5% were professionals, and all of them, almost all of them, were members of a foraging association. I then analyzed the knowledge of these people, and I used the number of items or the number of plants they reported in the questionnaire as a proxy, as well as a self-assessment knowledge level that they had the chance to give in the questionnaire. So I found overall that the professional were more knowledgeable than the amateur, and that the members were also more knowledgeable than the non-members. And then I tried to relate the learning ways, how people learn about foraging and wild edible plants. And I did not find any significant relationship between the different socio-cultural constructs. So most foragers in Norway, they learn from a personal practice and from family peers. So what is being foraged? I found 274 wild edible plants in Norway that belongs to 67 different botanical families. The most important collected plant parts are berries, leaves, and flowers. And I found a high number of reports for 23 wild edible plants. So I categorized them as the most important, or the cultural most important species in Norway. So why people forage? The first thing we saw, and the first thing I could analyze, is that there has been a shift in the foraging motivations since the Green Revolution. So before, it was a necessity, and this concept of matauk, mat is the food, auk is the increase, was related to a subsistence lifestyle and to other activities such as fishing, hunting. And now it's much more connected to this outdoor lifestyle, the Nordic outdoor lifestyle, connected to recreation. So it's the foraging activity is part of a lifestyle, and there is a strong goal to feel free and get a sense of freedom. And at the core of this freedom is knowledge, and there is a strong associated educational value to the foraging activity. So most of the respondents, they like to learn, and they like to teach about foraging to others, and they like to share. How people forage. So remember, I reported 23 most important species, and from these 23 most reported species, the collected plant parts are berries, leaves, and flowers. And in terms of volumes, I did not have any consistent data. So it's very difficult to for the foragers to recall volumes, and only 20% of them could give somehow a range of quantity they forage. However, this was unspecific to any plants. So they consider more the sustainability of the practice.
Hello.
When they, so sorry, I got confused. So yeah, they consider more the sustainability of the practice, about being aware of the surroundings, and about not about focusing more on the plant community rather than the plant individuals, and on the plant ecology, so how the plant reproduces, how it develops. So the perceived impact of foraging on plants in Norway is that foragers believe it's a part of a sustainable lifestyle. However, there are unsustainable practices, such as over-harvesting and the spread of invasives, edible invasives. And these are localized pressures. So, for example, mainly around densely populated areas in the big cities, fashionable plant resources are under pressure. 50% of the foragers knew about regulations, as an example, not being allowed to collect red-listed species, and they most reported that they were guided by their common sense as a way to forage in a sustainable way. So it clearly shows that there is a lack of information on how to forage in a sustainable way. So I then conducted an impact assessment, and we categorized the species we found based on the different information. So if there are natives, aliens, if they IUCN classification in the Norwegian Red List, but also the number of reports, the collected plant parts in the foraging process, and also the reproductive strategy. So we affected different letters from green to red, and whenever there is a star, it means that there is an exception to the category. And then we prioritized the species, and we found 20 species of concern. So the 20 species of concern, there are 4 alien species, 7 species vulnerable in the Norwegian Red List. And from the 50 G-starred category, 9 are least concerned, but highly salient and quite fashionable. As an example, Cicelrot, which is Polypodium vulgare, it's very nice licorice taste. It's a native species. It is least concern. It has not a high number of reports, but the roots are being collected, and it could be it's not very abundant in the local areas. So we scored it orange. In conclusion, foraging is perceived as a sustainable activity as part of a sustainable lifestyle. There are unsustainable practices in local places, and the foraging community has this desire to shift from common sense to common science, and they are calling for more efforts and get more knowledge. And even though the professional activities remains quite niche and informal, it's trendy and powerful in the promotion of sustainable foraging and in the promotion of using wild edible plants. So for perspective, we're gonna organize a workshop, participatory workshop, to design these guidelines together with the local key experts we identified during the study. So I'd like to thank you very much, and I'm happy to hear about the questions and feedback.
Great, thank you so much, Nicola. That was quite a comprehensive and interesting perspective on what ethnobotany can be for the world, and I hope that we might have some questions here. So if anyone has any questions, I see one already. So we'll probably only have time for 1 or maybe 2 questions, and so please try to keep it brief. Yeah. So this is Morgan Rule.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thanks for a great presentation, Nicola. I had a question about whether, you may have mentioned this and I missed it, but did you include any questions in the online survey about stewardship practices that any of the foragers use as they spend time with these plants?
Yeah. So I had not the time to share it in the presentation, but indeed, some people, they promote and they tend some plants. Specifically, there is one example on the shore, Crambe maritima, it's the sea kale, and people tend to promote it and manage it by weeding. And yeah, So there was a question about it in the questionnaire.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. Any other questions for Nicola? Okay, great. Well, thank you, Nicola, so much.
Thank you.
Very good. Okay, so we will move to our next panelist, who is Fernando Lopez Anito.
Yes.
Hi, Fernando. Yes, whenever
Hi.
you're ready.
Fine. Hello, everybody. It's good to have some squash and pumpkins in the fall symposium. So we're going to, well, what I want to show you is some relation about the cucurbita maxima and the cultivar groups of this crop. As you know, cucurbita maxima is possesses one of the greatest fruits of the plant kingdoms, and is very popular all over the world. Regarding why South America, cucurbita maxima was domesticated from the wild subspecies andrina. Subspecies andrina was very, spread in South America when it was when the fruits and seeds were dispersed by the megafauna that is now extinct. So nowadays, the distribution of the species and subspecies andrina is reduced to two places. One is in Argentina and Uruguay. One is called the Pampas, and another group of plants has been also described in Peru and Bolivia. Here you can see what the fruits like. There's a bitter, a small, hard-shelled, and a kind of beanie type plant. When we studied, we saw that there's many cultivar groups. What is an infra-specific category to define cultivars. So in the case of cucurbit, the cultivar groups are frequently defined by the type or shape of the fruit and color. The first classification was conducted in 1925 by Carster, who described what he called the horticultural groups. The Harvard type, which is a medium big fruit with elliptical form with tapering towards both ends. It could be gray, dark green, or orange. The turban group, which is very characteristic by the fruit, with looks like if you have two fruits, one growing inside the other one, when really you have pericarp tissue and pedicel tissue involved in the fruit. You have the banana group with elongated fruits. The color can range from pink, orange, and gray, and also dark green.
Fernando, I'm
Yes.
very sorry to interrupt, but your screen it's cut off on the edges. So it might be better if you share your slides from the other mode, from the non-presentation mode.
Like this?
So everyone can see the images. Yes, and then and then there you go. Yeah, so now we can see all the images. So I think I thought it was just me, but yeah, I think everyone was being cut off from seeing the beautiful images you have. So this is better. Yes, thank you.
Okay, now also you have the show group that was a slide, the picture I showed in the first slide, which nowadays are grown for horticultural competition with the biggest fruits. All these kinds of fruits are for mature consume. Then in the 1958, Grebenchikov also defined what he called corn varieties. He also presented the Harvard, Tarban, banana show cone varieties, but also include the Sapalito cone varieties, which is very popular in South America, and it's grown for the immature consumption like a summer squash. In the States and Europe, it's very common, the cucurbita people for summer squash, but in South America, what is very common for summer squash are the Sapalito type cultivars. Then we're going to the next one. Other cultivar groups are the buttercup, the nugget. These two are very common in the States and also in the case of buttercup in Japan. They have a medium, small size. Also the plomo type, which is a kind of big fruit with a gray color. Plomo means lead in Spanish. And in Brazil, we have a type of cultivar which is called moranga, which is very popular also, and it's got a kind of a orange fruit with a very rivet fruit, very markedly, and a kind of flattened like nugget and buttercup. So we wonder what, you see there, let's see. Oh, there we go. This one. So we wonder what are the relations among all cultivar groups. So we study many entries from different germ plants bank, including the USA green, the IPK, Germany, entries from Spain, also entries from some seed companies, and some own collections, mostly in subspecies Andriana. And we consider it qualitative and quantitative morphological traits for leaves, stems, flowers, fruits, seeds. We consider partition to seed and fruit in a way to see to what extent domestication were most for fruit or for seeds. And we conducted the evaluation along 2 seasons, dividing the taxations in 2 sets in order to have time to evaluate plants. One set was transplanted in an early planting date, and the second in a late planting date. And for a subset was for accessions, we consider also molecular markers, scrap markers. The output from the first set, I don't know if you can see it, okay. The blue points are the accessions and the yellow points are the traits. That's what we, sorry, this one. That's what we, the output from the principal component analysis. So we can see that the wild subspecies Andriana was concentrated in the left side. Sapalito, nugget, turban, and buttercup was positioned in the center of the distribution, and show however plomo, moranga, and banana was more to the right side. In case of Andriana, were associated to number of fruit per plant and number of square meter. Sapachito, nugget, turban, and buttercup were associated with rind thickness, petiole length, short internode, precocious fruit, precocious blossom, and number of lacus per fruit. And then the rest of the big fruit cultivars were more associated with flesh thickness, fruit weight, seed size, and grains of fruit needed to set a seed. So that means that in those groups, you need more fruit tissue to get or to obtain a seed. Similarly, in the second set, the distribution were quite similar. turban was somehow positioned in an intermediate between Sapalito and the show groups. And in the last picture, let's see, was considering the subset of accession in which we also analyzed the SRAB markers and molecular markers. And finally, we conducted an analysis together, the SRAB markers and the morphological characters. And we saw that the association was similar in a way that different groups were positioned together. Andrana in this case in the right side, Sapajito, Turban, Nugget, and Buttercup in the center, and to the above we were positioned show, Turban, Habar, and Banana. Let's see if you can see. Okay, so we hypothesized that the domestication was in a first step along the small, medium-sized fruit like Sapachito, Turban, with the thick rind, and then to the cultivars that have a greatest fruit like Habar, Plomo, Show, and Banana. In this way, we believe that was the way that domestication took place in the species. So that, I mean, the final consideration, and let's see if, thanks to all, let's see if any of the audience want to
Great. Yeah, well, thank you, Fernando, for returning us to our botanical roots so well. A great talk. So let's see if anyone in the audience, any attendees have any questions for Fernando. Either raise your hand by clicking on the raise hand button, or I am monitoring the Q&A. So if you want to type your question, you can type it there. Last chance for any questions. Well, great. Thank you so much, Fernando. And like I said, thank you again for bringing us back to the all-important botany of how the fundamentals of what we're doing. So thank you so much. Great. No, now we'll move on to our next panelist, Aurora Pren from Q. Hi, Aurora. You're muted.
Hi, how's it going?
Good.
Wonderful. Share the screen.
Great.
All right. Sharing it. Let's go. Hold on. Let's let me go. Let me put it into full screen first. Sorry. Oh boy. Let's see.
If you go, you can, oh, there you go. Okay, and then the bottom right, there's a button that looks like the podium, you see?
There it is.
Right there, yep. There you go, perfect.
All right. I want to thank the Society of Economic Botany for inviting me here today. I feel very grateful to present with such a wonderful group of people. All right. Just a little bit of brief overview. This project is in collaboration with Mark Nesbitt at the Royal Botanic Gardens Kew. And we're examining tea as in Camellia sinensis and the close cousins with similar or same uses. The project began last December in 2019 and ran for about 2 months on site at Kew before it went back to the States, and the project was interrupted with COVID but it was adapted to be done remotely in June and has continued since. So it's very much a work in progress, and we're very excited to present what we have thus far. The project's 3 central aims are really to understand how the tea collection came to Kew, the who, what, where, when, why, and how, what were the motivations of the donors, and really how it came to be. The second is, what does the collection tell us about tea production and trade in the 19th century? And 3, what is the significance and why does it matter today? In December, we started looking at the catalog and the different details that came along with the objects, as well as the objects themselves, and looking at really what the leaves can tell us. We're looking at these objects as primary evidence of material culture requiring a social and botanical awareness. I'm also bringing in years experience of the tea industry, which is providing some background and context to some of the items. All right. A little bit of summary of this subset of items. There's about 374, Camellia sinensis proper is 326. Kew's collection contains around 100,000 items. And as you can see, they're coming from around the world, with the 3 largest countries being China, India, and Sri Lanka. Our oldest items predates the founding of the museum in 1847 as 1808, and the newest object really just came in, and it's from June 2020. The most unique characteristic is that it's primarily mostly tea leaves rather than teaware. In fact, we only have about 10 pieces of teaware and a variety of formats, as you can see on the screen on the right. The majority is coming from the late 19th century. So that just kind of gives you a little bit of a textual overview. This is a visual overview of the different objects we have. We have loose tea, compressed tea buds, individual cubes of pressed black tea in the top, a tea brick in the top right, which might look familiar to some people, some different teacups, artwork, root carvings, and even on the top left, the image of the article crammed in the top there. There's different letters and articles and a variety of different labels that are coming along with the objects, which really make it quite fun. So from here, we're going to look at a variety of different objects around 4 different themes, and then we'll discuss them at the end. First one is looking at 4 items that are twisted and or bundled. The 2 on the right and the 3 jars are one type, and then on the left we have a second and a third type, tea type. These are really unique. We kind of put these together, and they're all handmade teas, whole leaf, that are stacked or twisted and then twisted on top of each other and tied with silk, possibly dyed of different botanical ingredients. And the one on the top left even has a little bit of newspaper you can see kind of wedged in there. So these really were really quite unusual. So the guests that we hosted in January 2020 found these of particular interest. They're really unfamiliar. We brought in 42 different people, as you saw in the earlier slide, and all of these items are really of large interest. So it kind of raises some questions here around revival. Can tea types be revived and diversity preserved from lessons learned from these 4 objects and the whole collection? And then to what extent do these practices exist at origin and are under-recorded in the West, perhaps? I think these 4 objects brought up many, many, many questions, but these 2 in particular. The second is looking at one particular origin of Myanmar. There are many origins represented in the collection, each deserving of attention, but I wanted to highlight Myanmar today just because of the uniqueness and the unfamiliarity of these 8 objects, 3 of which you can see on the screen, for myself and for many people who came and visited Kew. 2 of which, one of which on the screen, as you can see on the left, is Lopez tea. We have this tea in compressed form and in loose form. It is the only origin to have this tea used in this way. These 8 origins represent leaves meant for food and beverage, as well as medicine. And they even have a letter from one of the collectors quoting an article from the Times of Ceylon in 1892, quoting it as a necessity of life among locals. So some teas that I've seen from this origin today look very similar, and while others look quite different. So, and if anybody is familiar with Lopez tea, you know that it's microbially active and a ferment. So being fortunate enough to have these items from such remote landscapes on the other side of the globe in Kew in England, what can we learn about tea's beginnings, this food, medicine, and beverage transition, tea's diaspora, and Myanmar's modern tea culture from these objects? Raises many questions, and each individually, and is just an area of focus. The third one is looking at format. So these are 4 objects of different compressed leaves. On the left, you have a pu'er tea. On the top, you have, in the label, you might be able to see a butea tea, or compressed black tea. On the bottom, you have ball tea that was from a trading outpost in Western Tibet. And on the right side, you can see a brick tea imported into London in 1863. So there's so many different lessons within these 4 objects. In general, compression is a theme across the collection, from categories green to dark, different sizes and shapes, you name it. If anybody knows any bit about tea, a lot of compressed teas are travel over land. So the one on the right is very interesting, because it was one tea that was destined for Russia, but it came to London via ship in the mid-19th centuries. So these 4 objects, and just the idea of compression for tea type, ease of travel, storage, consumer expectations in general, raise some questions here. And what does this mean for trade at the time and even today? Were these objects made for export markets alone, or were they also consumed locally, and are they still today? And if you look at the pu'er tea and the black brick tea on the right, it might be most familiar to people, as it is to me. The pu'er tea is wrapped in leaves, and on the top, it was pressed in a mold with the character of cha, meaning tea, on the top. The last 2 items I want to look at are tea extract. It's a very unique item, and it's probably it's from 1812, as you can see on the bottom, and is most unusual, catching the eye of most visitors we hosted in January. And with the help of workshop attendees, we were able to make an initial guess of its manufacture, and as well as locating a modern day equivalent leading to the first donation of the year, which you can see in the orange packaging on the bottom right. I'm not sure if it's going to come through, but I thought it was worth a shot. These items are glued or adhered to this piece of paper in a box. And looking closely, you can see that there's a variety of different cultural symbols, flowers, leaves, and even Chinese characters, which you can see on the middle photo, including the character for people and tea, from what you can tell. So this brings up many different questions here around bioculture collections in the 21st century. Should the collection grow, and how? Right? Is a big question to discuss. And can this collection contribute to preserving and increasing tea's biocultural diversity? Another big question. And how best should this collection be available, utilized for the public, researchers, and the whole supply chain from producers to consumers? So looking ahead in the bioculture diversity of Kew's collection, we can go back and look at these 4 areas of groups. Well, we've been working with an important group of stakeholders, as I've mentioned, in January and since. And looking ahead, we hope to kind of continue working with this group, but then also incorporate more voices with different perspectives throughout the whole supply chain. The challenge is, how do we do this remotely? So these 4 things, looking at revival, origin focus, trade histories, and bioculture collections in the 21st century, are only 4 themes here that we wanted to kind of bring up and discuss today as this project is in progress, as I said. So far, we've been really looking at which items are most unique and which ones may have disappeared and how potentially they could be revived, as in the twisted tea. The origin focus, trying to connect with different people in country. And so far we've been working with a few researchers at the New York Botanical Garden to try to get the images and facts in the hands of people who know to get their insight. And as far as for trade histories go, we've begun different archival research and diving into the object histories and background of the donors, trying to answer some of these questions that we've brought up of who, what, where, when, why, and how. And then the last one, the extracts, the tea lozenges is very exciting that one person of the 42 brought in found it familiar and had a contact of how we can to source a donation for us. And it was very exciting and really asked a lot of questions of how can we kind of continue this and do it in a respectful manner and grow the collection to really strengthen what Q has, but then also while we grow it. So yeah, I think that's all I had.
Thank you, Aurora. What an interesting historical perspective, something that is very important for our discipline. Thank you so much. So let's see if there are any questions. If you have any, please raise your hand in the chat there, or you can submit. Trish Flaster actually asked a question. She's typed it in. What is the advantage of the twisted and bundled versus other forms?
Advantages of it. I haven't had it brewed myself. I assume that it will be untied to allow the leaves a chance to unfurl and get a full infusion. It may just be one stick in the stack. You can see that there's multiple layered on and then tied on either ends. And if you look at just brewing that same whole leaf versus if you grind it up into having more surface area, you're going to get a completely different infusion. So tea is very intricate like that and called fancy and called old men's eyebrows. There's different names that have kind of come along with it. Just shows how highly valued they were and how difficult and probably expensive they were to make at the time. So there's different culture meaning there, but then also just leaf-wise, having a whole leaf versus having called like a tea bag cut where it's finely ground for even the same great gram weight, you're going to have a different extraction and different experience entirely.
Great, thank you. And we have another question from Robbie Hart who says, you've uncovered some fantastic information about the objects. Is there a way these data can be attached to object records going forward?
Absolutely. So right now the objects are able to be found on Q's database online. And then in time, we hope to photograph all the objects and then match the objects along with all of the research that we're doing and expand the catalog and put 2 and 2 together online and make it available for everybody as soon as we can and as soon as the world starts opening up. But great question, because that is exactly our goal.
Perfect, thank you. Anyone else have any questions that they want to ask, either by raising your hand or by typing something into the Q&A section? Okay, great. Well, thank you, Aurora, so much. We've reached the portion of the event where we're going to take a break. I'm going to just briefly share my screen so that you can see the agenda again for those of you who didn't see it on the Eventbrite page. So we have a half an hour break now from 2:45 to 3:15 p.m. Eastern time, so New York time. At 3:15, we'll come back with 6 more presentations, starting with Mariana Campos Rivera and going until 4:45, and then we'll have a brief closing. Great. So I'm gonna, and just so everyone knows, we are recording this session as well. So this will be available to you or your students or friends, people that you want to see this. So I'm gonna stop sharing now. And I'm just going to, so if you want to, I'm gonna stop my video and mute myself. I will be monitoring if anyone has any questions for me, but I'm also gonna put a, just something up so as people come in, they'll know that we're just on a break. You feel free to just step away from your computer or however you want to. You don't have to log off. So the presentation will continue. It'll just be silent for the next 30 minutes. Any questions that you want to just put into the Q&A. All right, thank you all, and we'll see you in 30 minutes. Hi, Mariana.
Hi.
Hi, everyone. We'll be getting started in just a minute. So if you have this on in the background and you can hear my voice, maybe you want to come on over to the computer. Great, and I'm just going to share the agenda for the 1 minute that we have so everyone can be reminded. Find it. There it is. Okay, everyone, it's 3:15. Just a reminder of what is coming up over the next hour and a half to 2 hours for our presentations. And Mariana is here, so we should probably just get going. Great. So Mariana, if you'd like to start, you can share your screen and introduce yourself.
Perfect. Thank you. Okay. Okay, so can everyone see that?
Yes, and if you just want to make it full screen.
Yeah, okay.
Perfect.
Okay, so thank you to the Society of Economic Botany for this chance, and I find it really useful, and I'm really grateful to be able to share like research that is on its early stages. So my master projects, I study at the University of Saskatchewan. I'm from Mexico, but I'm living now in Canada. And my master project is the role of youth as traditional ecological knowledge holders in rural Oaxaca, Mexico. So now we're facing a time where we are dealing with tons of environmental and social cultural struggles. And the role of youth on all of this has been like addressed in different ways, from like activists and protests and ways they organize. But this is us looking at the big picture. And I'm really interested in looking at the local level, what's happening there, right? Especially because people living in rural and local areas that heavily depend on natural resources are facing these environmental struggles more heavily, right? So a way of natural resource management well studied is community-based natural resource management. These kind of practices are heavily reliant on the participation of local actors who make decisions upon their land and their resources by acting through community institutions. And the way they can act and make decisions is because they know their land and their resources pretty well. And this knowledge is often called traditional ecological knowledge, or TEC, right? Well, what is TEC? Basically, it's a knowledge system. This means that it changes, it's dynamic, it adapts, it's based on experience, and it changes not only from space and time, but also from person to person from the same community. The key thing that I want you to remember about TEC is that it's built and is shaped by interactions. Either these are people interacting with the environment or people interacting with each other. A way in which knowledge is preserved is through transmission. And this can be intragenerational, like from older people to younger generations. And this is well researched in academia. And we know its importance because the intragenerational transmission is the way in which knowledge is preserved through time. But there's another way of transmission, and this is intergenerational. From people from the same age, peers, they share what they know with each other. And the importance of this way of transmitting knowledge is that it acts new information to the whole system, right? It allows knowledge to adapt to changing environments and to innovate in ways in which natural resources could be managed. But this way of transmission is often overlooked in research. So going back to community-based natural resource management, I think it's important to address that even if it's based on community members, not all the members of a same community participate in an equal way or are represented in an equal way. And one of these groups is youth, people between like on their mid-teens or early 30s, late 20s. And we don't know much about what they know, what they want to do, like their experiences, what they want to do with their life in their communities. And also we don't know how they share what they know with each other, right? And I really think that there's a huge importance on this because the tech that youth has could help to adapt or innovate in local ways of managing resources. And by sharing with others from their same age group, I think that could make youth feel empowered and like willing to participate. So with all of this in mind, we designed our research with the purpose of explore youth health tech, how is it transmitted, and the role of youth for supporting local research management. We have 3 different objectives: describe what youth know or tech domains, map how transmission of knowledge is occurring, happening between youth, to youth, and among youth, and also to explore opportunities for like tech transmission, or especially horizontal transmission. Where is this happening? In southern Mexico, in a state called Oaxaca. That is a really interesting place because it has a very high bicultural diversity, both biological and cultural, and also because almost 80% of its territory is owned by local communities. Right? They have the land rights and land tenure over their land. The research design, we basically have 2 different sets of participants: experts, that is basically practitioners from NGOs and academia that work in topics related to tech and youth and local natural resource management, and also rural youth participating in tech-related initiatives in Oaxaca. The methods are like interviews to experts and youth, and also photo voice and focus group discussions with youth. Well, this was the original research design like a year ago, but as we know, tons of things change. So the question and the challenge that we needed to face was how to do field work without actually going to the field. Right? And this gave us 2 different challenges. The first one to find our participants, and the second one to do the interviews. Usually you find your participants by living in the communities and introducing yourself and just living there. But here I use social media to find the youth that I wanted to interview. I spent tons of time on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram and all those tools, using keywords to find like young people living in Oaxaca interested in traditional knowledge and ways of sharing it. And doing interviews also was a challenge because every time I needed to introduce myself and my research topic, and I needed to be flexible about how to do them. I have done interviews through Skype, through phone calls, through Zoom, through WhatsApp. So yeah, this year has taught me a lot of flexibility around field work. And so far, what are youth doing in Oaxaca? Well, actually, they are doing like a lot, and they're really active. I have found 35 different initiatives from youth with different topics, right? Really diverse, that go from language conservation, land rights, food security, water security, ecotourism, ethnomecology, women's rights, use of technology, intercultural education, textiles, forest conservation, and the importance of identity and building networks between youth, rural youth and indigenous youth in Oaxaca. These are some quotes from some interviews that I have done so far. This one is from a researcher that has worked a lot with youth, not in Oaxaca, but in another region of Mexico. And he points out that youth, they are really interested in participating actively on their communities, and they have new and fresh ideas, and they would like to stay in their communities and live there. But the challenge that youth is facing right now is to find their spaces in their communities to actively participate and have a voice. But also they are really interested, youth, in engaging and knowing other people doing similar stuff. Like we can see in this quote from Francisco, a 20-year-old man that is working topics of water security in the Oaxacan Istmus. He says that he always it's really keen to hear about other youth working, and they want to share and they want to learn from each other. So this is, as you can see, this is an ongoing research. So far, I have done 8 interviews, 5 with experts and 3 with youth from different regions of Oaxaca. And what is next is to keep interviewing youth, map how people is engaged in tech transmission and youth-based projects. And by map, I mean like saying who is where doing what, and how can you contact them, and how could you like build a network of knowledge sharing between youth. And another main goal is to host a focus group discussion between different youth that participate in different projects, so they can have like this knowledge sharing experience. I want to thank the University of Saskatchewan and the School of Environmental and Sustainability for the funding, and the Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada, and a partner NGO, ERA, for helping me to build the links in Oaxaca. And I especially want to thank my supervisor, James Robson, for all his support during these challenging times.
Thank you so much, Mariana. What an interesting study on kind of the fundamentals of doing this type of field research that I hope will inspire other students and other people doing work in the field. If anyone has any questions for Mariana, please raise your hand or put a question in the Q&A and I'll be happy to read it. Great, we have a question from Liz Andrew. You can unmute yourself if you'd like, Liz.
Hello.
Yep, we can hear you.
This is not Liz, but her husband.
Okay.
Crookshank, using the same screen. Well, thank you very much for that splendid Oaxaca presentation. I'd like to ask, when you were putting this presentation together, how did you think about all the disparate people who you captured to give you their views on ethnobotany, if you like, from across the region who responded to your WhatsApps or Zooms or whatever?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was really interesting, because I had to like take off my ethnobiologist hat and stop using concepts or terms as traditional ecological knowledge or natural research management. So basically, I just start to think as a young person and start to use the tools, the online tools that I had, and start to dig and use like new ways of finding information, like hashtags or webinars, and use keywords as just, for example, textiles or indigenous youth. And that way I could come up with tons of people that are doing things, and I only reach out to them by how you reach out to anyone that you want to contact on social media.
Great, thank you. Liz's husband.
Thank you very much.
We didn't get your first name. Great, and there's another question from Adriana Ramirez. In Oaxaca, many youth speak other languages, for example, Zapoteco. How will you manage this situation?
That's a limitation that I do have. Well, most youth are bilingual, from like either Spanish and their indigenous language, or their indigenous language and English, or some of them are just monolingual. But I think since I'm finding them through social media, there's certain room for communication with others, because most of us are like Spanish speakers. So we will hold that focus group in Spanish, I would say.
Great, thank you. One last call for questions. Okay, great. Well, thank you. Oh, wait, we have, sorry, last chance. Okay, we're gonna let Jim.
Okay.
It's not Jim, if you want to type your question quickly, it's not allowed. You're using an older version of Zoom. I'm getting an error. So perhaps in the interest of time, you can ask the question in Q&A and we can make sure it gets answered during the next speaker.
I'm gonna type my email if someone wants to.
Perfect. Okay, thank you so much, Mariana. We're gonna move on now to Michael's presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Hi, Michael.
Should be good. Everybody see pretty good?
Yep, it looks great.
Okay, so my presentation, along with Orogawe, will focus on the analysis of cultural importance indices and their use by ethnobotanists to predict cultural keystone species designation. Oh, let's see. Move my pointer. Okay, so essentially our research focus is assessing commonly employed indices of cultural importance in ethnobotany and determining how robust they are in predicting cultural keystone species status. To give a little background, medicinal plant species contribute to about $98 billion in revenue worldwide. Many of these culturally important plant species often play pivotal roles in the subsistence strategies and local livelihoods of cultural groups around the world. Certain species known as cultural keystone species are expected to play central roles in maintaining stability in human societies and to be frequently harvested. The idea of cultural keystone species stems from a theoretical framework in ethnobotany that's defined them as culturally important plant species that play essential roles in material and non-material elements of culture. The loss of these species are predicted to lead to significant community disruptions, and they are likely to be irreplaceable. This theoretical framework in ethnobotany has been widely discussed and made popular by Nancy Turner and her group in terms of its use in coupled biocultural conservation approaches. According to the theory, cultural keystone species are expected to have high use values, a high level of irreplaceability, species ethnotaxonomic diversity, a psychosocial cultural function within a given community, use and resource acquisition, and a high level of importance. Species that meet these criteria essentially qualify for cultural keystone species designation. Now, identifying cultural keystone species is proven challenging. Most studies to date that have provided a reproducible measure have inferred cultural keystone species status by using cultural importance indices. The first index used to infer cultural keystone species designation is the Index of Cultural Significance proposed by Garibaldi and Turner. This index has been widely used, however, has been criticized for incorporating elements of researcher subjectivity. As a result, subsequent indices and adaptations of this index have been used to infer cultural keystone species designation. So the goal of our study was to test how 12 commonly employed indices of cultural importance that you see here, how well they perform in predicting cultural keystone species status. Now, when we look at the formulas for these indices, it's clear that most of them lack parameters for the fundamental criteria of cultural keystone species designation, such as parameters for species replaceability and species ethnotaxonomic diversity. But when we look closely, we see many of them contain similar parameters such as species use values, or the number of participants of a given study. Therefore, we expected that many of these indices would be correlated, and we tested for a correlation among these indices and how well they predicted cultural keystone species designation. To do so, we conducted our study in the Shipibo Kaniwo community of Paoyan, located along the riverbanks of the Ukiele River. This is one of the major tributaries of the Amazon. The community is located in the Peruvian part of the Amazon. It has a tropical climate with 26 degrees Celsius annual temperature, about 1,600 millimeters of annual rainfall, and is located about 132 meters above sea level. The community consists of about 2,000 inhabitants belonging to a panolinguistic family that have long inhabited the area. Livelihood strategies employed by the community primarily focus on logging secondary forest and harvesting non-timber forest products that are sold in major cities or exported. So the goal of our data collection here was to estimate the indices of cultural importance, to compare them, and to estimate a cultural keystone species score for each species cited by participants. To do so, we used a triangulation of methods consisting of free listing and semi-structured interviews with 30 participants in the community. Interviewees were recruited via snowball sampling approach, where locally recognized participants considered knowledgeable medicinal plant users, facilitated introductions to other adept knowledgeable medicinal plant users. These approaches were coupled with a walk in the woods approach and participant observation to observe botanical species cited by participants in situ to verify the botanical identity and to observe biomass harvested for each species. Subsequently, voucher specimens were collected and deposited in the UNAP herbarium. It's important to mention that all participants were 18 years and older. We obtained free and prior informed consent, and participation was voluntary in accordance with the University of Hawaii at Manoa IRB. It's also important to mention that although our data collection primarily focused around medicinal plant species, these same approaches can be used for species whose uses extend beyond medicinal value. From our free listing and semi-structured interviews, a total of 62 species were cited. For each species, we estimated their cultural importance and developed a cultural keystone species score. To estimate the local of importance for each species, we used the 12 commonly employed cultural importance indices, and these data were used to test for a correlation among indices and to test how well they perform in predicting cultural keystone species designation. In developing a cultural keystone species score, we sought to do so objectively by estimating each of the criteria for cultural keystone species status indirectly. So for species use values and importance, we used the use value citation index proposed by Phillips and Gentry. To estimate species irreplaceability, this was estimated as the proportion of the total number of species that can substitute a given use for species and the total number of species cited by participants divided by the total number of uses for a given species. To estimate species ethnotaxonomic diversity, we used an adaptation of the Shannon-Weiner Species Diversity Index, where P sub I is the proportion of the total number of participants that list a given species vernacular name and the total number of participants that mention vernacular names for a given species. To estimate a psychosocial cultural function score for each species, we asked the following questions: if it had a story associated with their ancestors, if it had a song, if it was involved in ritual, if it had an anthropomorphic form, or if it was frequently discussed and known in the community. To ensure an objective approach, we recorded all responses as binary data, 0 for no, 1 for yes. And to estimate an overall psychosocial cultural function score for each species, we summed the totals across each of the questions for a total score. To estimate resource acquisition, we asked for each species if it was traded or sold, and these data were also recorded as binary to ensure objectivity. Now, to test for a correlation among the indices, we used principal component analysis via a correlation matrix. Subsequently, we also use pairwise correlations to see how strongly these indices were correlated with our developed cultural keystone species score. Now, to develop our cultural keystone species score, we also use another principal component analysis via correlation matrix. All analysis were conducted in R. Subsequently, we use phylogenetic generalized least square models and generalized linear models to test how strongly these indices predicted cultural keystone species status. It is important to mention that the assumption of linear models is that there's independence between observations. Due to the shared evolutionary history between our species cited by participants, we controlled for phylogenetically driven non-independent residuals in our PGLS models by using a Brownian correlation structure. And to select the best models with the greatest explanatory power, we used an information theoretic approach by estimating their delta Akaike information criteria for each model as the difference in their AIC and the lowest AIC. And models with the delta AIC less than 2 were considered model candidates. Now, looking at the results from our principal component analysis and testing the correlation among the indices, we see that 10 out of the 12 indices are positively correlated, with 1 negatively correlated index and 1 index that was not correlated amongst the other ones. Now, to select an index to see how strongly the positively correlated indices predicted cultural keystone species status, we selected a representative index and the remaining 2 indices for our regression models. In developing our cultural keystone species score, we can see that cultural keystone species status was captured by 2 major axes, one dominated by species use values and one dominated by species replaceability. Now, by combining the principal component 1 and 2, this allowed us to calculate a combined cultural keystone species score for each species that explained over 60% of the variance, which has then been compared with our representative index for all the positively correlated indices and the other 2 remaining indices of cultural importance. Now, the results of our regression models indicate that controlling for species evolutionary history actually improved our models by about 4 units AIC. In addition, when we compare our PGLS models and our GLM models, we see that the quality use value agreement index was a significant predictor of cultural keystone species designation. However, had we not controlled for phylogeny or a shared evolutionary history between species, we may have wrongly suggested that the cultural value index and the positively correlated indices were marginally significant predictors of cultural keystone species status. Now, although we saw that the quality use value agreement index was significantly predicting our cultural keystone species score, when we look at our pairwise correlations between our developed score and the indices of cultural importance, we see at best they capture about a 32 and 45% correlation with our developed score. And this suggests that even our best index has limited predictive power of cultural keystone species status. And this is expected because many of these indices, again, lack all the fundamental criteria for keystone designation. So in conclusion, we highlight for the cautious use of cultural importance indices to predict cultural keystone species status, and that most of these indices are redundant and should be tested with newly developed indices to avoid redundancy. And controlling for evolutionary history improved our models and resulted in greater explanatory power, which was essential to testing these predictions. We also provide a new synthetic measure for cultural keystone species status. And with that, I give incredible thanks to all my collaborators, especially the community of Paoyan, all of my mentors, and those that funded my research, including the Society of Economic Botany and the Missouri Botanical Garden. And with that, I welcome any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Koa. Talk about doing the really hard work to advance the field. Greatly appreciate what you're doing.
Thanks.
So if anyone has any questions, please type them in the Q&A box or raise your hand and I'll let you speak. Okay, we have a question from Robbie Hart. Thank you so much for this thoughtful and stimulating presentation. I'm looking forward to seeing the results in print. It would be fantastic to see these methods more widely used. I wonder, do you think a similar comparison of metrics could be done meta-analytical with existing data from other studies, or was it essential to your comparison that you conducted new fieldwork with multiple targeted methods?
I think that's a wonderful question, and thank you very much. I think it's an important question. Realistically, at this point, it was important to use novel approaches, especially in estimating cultural keystone species score, because many of the studies to date have infer them either by cultural importance indices or use qualitative methods to infer keystone species status. As a result, we don't have a large amount of data sets that have used, robust measures for comparisons or across locations, geographic locations, or timescales. So it would be great to see, other methods used in the future that will offer the possibility to do so.
Great. And an anonymous attendee asks, one of the definitions of biological keystone species is a species that has an ecological impact greater than expected based on its abundance on the landscape. Do you think that abundance has a role in defining a species as cultural keystone? And I'll just note that we are running out of time, so short answer, please.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Part of what the cultural keystone species theory was borrowed from ecology, from the ecological keystone species framework as well. And there are predicted parallels between ecological systems and social systems as well, and their functions in keystone function. That's been discussed in the literature, and I hope to see more robust comparisons.
Perfect. Thank you so much. There is one more question in the Q&A, but I'll relay that to you offline.
Okay, thank
Great.
you.
Thank you, Dr. Code. Okay, I believe our next speaker is Daniel Williams. Hi, Daniel. Feel free to unmute yourself and you can join in.
Hi, I'm working on it.
Oh, perfect.
All right.
Perfect.
So I want to thank everyone for watching today. It's wonderful to have so many people to listen to a presentation and to hear everyone else's. My name's Daniel Williams. I'm a PhD student at The Ohio State University in the Department of Horticulture and Crop Science. I'm working with my advisor, Jonathan Fresnedo Ramirez, on the concept of neo-domestication. Our concept of neo-domestication is bigger than a single PhD program, bigger than a few years of study. And so I'm going to be presenting some of the big ideas, but also some of the specifics that I'll be working on in my program. I want to start by asking, how should we think about neo-domestication in this context? And really dive down by asking, what are the products of domestication? Well, the products of domestication are crops and knowledge systems that support the crops. And what are crops? Crops are tools that we use to improve our efficiency to transform natural resources to meet human needs. Humans have proven quite capable of improving tools over time as societal needs and technology change. So can we describe domestication as a technological process? Well, let's look at domestication syndrome. I have domestication syndrome shown here in maize. It's a pattern of traits in domesticated plants. We can see apical dominance in the reduced branching, increase in fruit size, an increase in yield. But overall, in domestication, we see an increase in homogeneity. All of the seeds are germinating at the same time, they're growing at approximately the same rate, they're flowering at the same time, and you can expect to harvest them all at approximately the same time. So you have reliable yield from these domesticated crops. It makes them stand out from their wild progenitors. And so we might conceptualize that domestication is a repeatable process for producing crops for emerging needs. And if we look at Vavilov's law of homologous series of variation, we see that he saw the same kind of patterns emerging 100 years ago. in the phenotypes of these, the spikes of cereal crops, where we can see similar patterns of fruit enlargement and on reduction happening independently in different cereals. We see a similar pattern emerging in root crops, where we have a homologous series of phenotypic variation based on similar human pressures. We can see that Harlan in 1973 proposed that maybe related crops under similar human pressures are following the same pathway to domestication. Okay, so this is phenotypes, but what's going on the genetic level? Do we see the same kind of patterns happening with the genetics? Well, if you line up the genomes, line up chromosome by chromosome, I have grasses on the left and nightshades on the right. And not only are the chromosomes collinear, but some of the main genes that we observe in domestication are lined up in the same places of each chromosome. And so the basic assumption is, yes, the patterns of synteny of series of variation are more than just phenotype deep. They go deep into the genetics, into the chromosome patterns. So how can we use this to address societal needs? I've been talking about societal needs in terms of food, but of course, crops are much broader than that, and society needs much more than just food. These are a sample of agricultural products, biological materials that we use every day. I want to highlight too on the bottom there, we have tires and the latex gloves are both derived from natural rubber. And so natural rubber is clearly a hugely important across a variety of industries. Let's look at where it comes from. It comes from the rubber tree, which is grown in these clonal plantations, predominantly in Southeast Asia. It's been the predominant source of rubber for more than a century. But I want to highlight that it is a fragile system. Almost all of the world's natural rubber comes from a single geographic region, from a single plant that has a long life cycle, is hard to breed. Also, it is under lots of risks. We have biological risks from this fungal disease, which is reducing production this year by about 800,000 metric tons, which is 2/3 of what the United States imports annually. We also have geopolitical risks. Going back to World War II, Japan was able to control Southeast Asia and was able to cut off the supply, 90% of the rubber imports to Europe, the United States, and the Soviet Union. Of course, we're not at war with Japan anymore, but do I need to remind everyone that there has been an active trade war and that trade was disrupted with the COVID epidemic? And so having our sources for a single product isolated in a geographic region is inherently risky. So we'd like alternatives. There are some alternatives. Petroleum-derived rubber works for some things, but it doesn't have the long chains, the chemical and physical properties that we use natural rubber for. Even tires are a mixture of natural and synthetic. We can't use all synthetic for every product. So are there other potential sources, potential crops that we could look to derive natural rubber? And there are. One of these is the rubber dandelion, Taraxacum coxsages, sometimes abbreviated TK or TKS. It's a dandelion, you can see it there, native to Central Asia, sexual diploid with a 1 to 2 year life cycle. And there's some really great features about this as a crop. Its management is compatible with what we expect a temporal crop to look like. You can grow it in a greenhouse, you can grow it in a field, you can breed them easily. They're not massive plants. And most importantly for this natural rubber is that the rubber is high molecular weight. Long chains mean durable, stretchy, resilient rubber, which is what we want from natural rubber. So why aren't we using it if this is such a great potential alternative crop? And the answer is we tried. During World War II, when the rubber shortages were so widespread, the United States and the Soviet Union dumped tons of money into growing plantations of it. You can see they even managed to harvest enough to produce tires. But all of these experiments largely failed because it didn't respond well to clonal propagation. It didn't respond well to existing breeding methods. And when you grow it in a field setting, it's not homogeneous. Every plant is doing its own thing, germinating, sprouting, growing at different rates, flowering at different times. And generally it grows less vigorously than the wild dandelion. So it's easily outcompeted and hard to weed if you can't tell the difference between wild dandelions and the stuff you're trying to grow. Wild dandelions produce much, much less rubber. it's a complete waste if you have too much wild dandelions in your field. So they were never able to make this economical, and the project was abandoned after World War II and trade resumed. So, okay, something went wrong. Can we figure out what went wrong? I have a timeline up here. On the left is biotechnology. On the right is some conceptual theories that emerged. And I want to highlight the dandelion rubber trials were in the 30s and 40s, which is about the same time we see the commercialization of hybrid maize and the start of the Green Revolution. I mean, Norman Borlaug's getting his PhD right about here. And so it wasn't until after that, into the 50s through the 80s, where we see a development of domestication theory. And as that's happening, we see an emergence of biotechnology tools that we can use to analyze the genetics. And in 2000, we have the first plant genome published. So we have all of these new tools, resources, conceptual models to analyze how domestication works that were inaccessible at the time they tried to make this into a productive crop. So now that we have this, how do we integrate it into a theory or into a process to make new crops today? This is a busy diagram of how I conceptualize neo-domestication and trying to fit ideas together. And I'll show it again later, and so you have another chance to look at it. The main thing I want to talk about is that this is an idea informed by industry, science, and technology. We have, whoops. The economics of the industry is forming the crop idiotype, which we then use to build a selection of tools, which we use for breeding, selection, and neo-domestication. And so since the crop idiotype is kind of central to building the tools, I want to start there. How do you develop a crop idiotype? Domestication starts with the primary concerns of usefulness, reliability, homogeneity, and revenue or some kind of valuable product. With neo-domestication, we have other concerns too, like compliance. So this is like intellectual property, it's laws, regulations, standards, and societal values that we need to consider when developing new crops. So once we have an idiotype, we need to look at the biological system we're working with, dandelions, and try to build tools and resources. So we look at the dandelions and we see, okay, they have variation in a whole bunch of traits that might be commercially interesting or improve this as a crop. I have some of these listed, and we can then look to related species to see if they have variations or characterized genes describing the same kind of traits. So here we have some other asteroid species, sunflowers, lettuce, and chicory, and we can see the same kinds of patterns of homologous series of variation we observed in other crops. So we expect homologous series of variation to work on a phenotypic and genotypic level in our rubber dandelions. And we can analyze the genes that are potentially controlling that in related species and find their variation in the rubber dandelion germplasm that we're working with. Some traits are complex. They might be more than one gene, and they might not have been well characterized in related species. And so we can build segregated populations, pedigrees to characterize how the associations between traits and genotypes to try and isolate, build molecular markers, which we can then use for breeding. This is a less direct process, but it's tried and true in the breeding programs, and we'll see where it goes. Ultimately, we expect the products to produce foundational germplasm. These are not necessarily crops that are ready to go in the ground, but they're improved so that breeders can breed valuable agricultural products with them. So high rubber homogeneity. These are the kinds of traits that we're building in our foundational germplasm. And of course, genetic information that we can use for selection, like molecular markers. But we're also looking to refine a conceptual framework for neo-domestication and build a repeatable process for neo-domestication of new biomaterial crops. And that brings me back here, where I'm trying to fit all of the ideas into this framework, and I'll be testing out this process as I move forward. I already know that I've forgotten some things. I had to add the word compliance in here, which I think fits with the economics compliance is a constraint on economics. I'm missing human knowledge systems and training of human personnel, which probably fits on the tools as they are practitioners, which will be applying the selection pressures. And so I'm working on developing this, and I'd like feedback if anyone has any. That concludes my talk. I'll move to thanking my committee, members of the lab and associated labs. Also, we're working with a biotechnology center, molecular and cellular imaging center, and the personnel there. And this is funded by a NIFA award. And so I have the information listed. Thank you, everyone.
Yes, thank you so much, Daniel. That was really fascinating. And I'll say quickly, at the Harvard University Herbarium, where I've worked for several years, in the economic botany collection, there's a really large specimen of dandelion latex that was added by Richard Schultes himself. So this is really particularly interesting to me. Does anyone have, we have time for one quick question. And we have one. Okay, Ryan McGinnis asked, domesticated species often experience a bottleneck effect, which leads to a decrease in biodiversity within crops, which can leave them susceptible to insects and pathogens. What are some methods to prevent this bottleneck effect before it becomes a problem? And I'll add, we have just 1 minute.
Right. So as we're moving from wild plants to foundational germplasm, one of the key goals is to maintain diversity in the germplasm. And so we're not restricting all of this into a single agriculturally ready crop. We're producing a bunch of lines that each are specialized in particular traits that maintain diversity. And then we can breed from the foundational germplasm to elite cultivars to meet specific targeted needs that might change over time. So hopefully the foundational germplasm will maintain all of the diversity that we have in our germplasm today.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Daniel.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks. Okay, so our next presenter is Ella Vardman. Ella, if you're here, you can unmute yourself and
Can I share my screen?
Perfect.
Okay. John, can you see my screen?
Yes, I can. It looks great.
Okay, great. So I'm Ella Vardman. I'm a doctoral student at the City University of New York and the New York Botanical Garden in the Joint Plant Sciences PhD program. And I study medicinal plants for women's health and urban ethnobotany. So what does it mean when I say urban ethnobotany? Half the world's population already lives in cities, and that number is expected to rise significantly in the next few decades. So what does that mean for traditional medicine globally, as well as plant knowledge globally? And I think what's important to remember here, as people, we don't just leave our cultures behind when we come to new places. We bring our cultural beliefs and our perceptions of health and disease, as well as the medicines that we use to cure ourselves, like medicinal plants, with us when we come to new environments. So at the New York Botanical Garden, we've done a lot of research with this already. So we've seen previous trends where people are using more food medicines in cities, as well as knowledge not necessarily being age dependent. And so thinking about how we can do this, where we can combine traditional and scientific knowledge to support community health in cities. And New York City is a really wonderful place to study urban ethnobotany. There are 3.1 million immigrants living here. That's 37% of New Yorkers that were born in different countries all over the world. And at the New York Botanical Garden, we've primarily focused our urban ethnobotany collaborations with the Caribbean community. So we've done a lot of work with immigrants from the Dominican Republic, as well as the Jamaican community, the Puerto Rican community, and the Mexican communities. And you can see that I've highlighted the Haitian community here as well. And so as we look to expand our urban ethnobotany program within the Caribbean community in New York City, Haiti is kind of the next step as we expand our program. And going back to thinking about how to marry scientific and traditional knowledge is something that we've done at the New York Botanical Garden. My mentor, Dr. Ina Vanderberg, has started this Carlo E2 program, which focuses on Caribbean and Latino ethnobotany and ethnomedicine. So it's taking what we've learned from our urban ethnobotanical studies and conveying that to doctors and medical students who have Caribbean and Latino patients in New York City so they can provide culturally competent care. So, okay, thinking about laying the foundation for our work in the Haitian community, we've done a lot of work with the Dominican community in New York City, and Haiti and Dominican Republic have some things in common. So they're both located on the island of Hispaniola, which is the second largest island in the Caribbean. And even though Haiti and Dominican Republic have two entirely different cultures, they do have the shared flora on the island. So they have a shared repository of plants that can be used as medicine. And when immigrants from Haiti and the Dominican Republic come to New York City, there's also a shared flora and markets and botanicas, which are these really cool specialty herb stores that really serve the Caribbean communities that sell a lot of medicinal plants, greengrocers and parks. So thinking about how two very different cultures that have a shared flora in different places, how they adapt their plant knowledge in different environments. So the objectives of this study were to do one, an intercultural comparison, looking at women's health concerns treated with medicinal plants and plants used by Dominicans for women's health in New York City and Dominican Republic. And then taking that data and expanding it larger to do an intercultural comparison. So looking at plants that were used in New York City by Dominicans for women's health conditions and comparing that with the Haitian ethnomedicinal literature to see where the overlapping species were. And then taking that a step further and looking at those overlapping species and seeing what's known about them in the biomedical literature. So what's their bioactivity? Are they effective at curing disease, or do they need to have more work done with them? And then all that lays the foundation for my future research, which will be an ethnobotanical survey with the Haitian community in New York City, as well as laboratory studies looking at plants that are used for women's health by Dominican and Haitian immigrants in New York. So starting with the methodology, so the survey that was done in the Dominican Republic in New York City was done by my mentor, Dr. Ina Vandenberg, a few years ago. And it covered a larger range of health conditions, but I was only looking at the women's health data, which was reported in these plant use reports. So each participant was assigned a code to remain anonymous. There was some demographic information. And then the common name of the plant, the health condition, and how it was administered was reported. So these are plant use reports for Petravia alliacea, which is shown up here in the corner. And the common name in Spanish is Animu, and it was reported to be used for birth, vaginal infections, and STIs, both by male and female participants in New York City. And so looking at that comparison between our study in the Dominican Republic and in New York City, there was a lot of similar trends to what we've seen before. So there were a good number of overlapping plant species used in both places. The top three plant species, which were Metricaria camellia, Aurelia tuberosa, and Spermacostea surgens, were all, they coincided. So they were the top three species in both locations. And it's also the uses of those top three species also coincided in both locations. And there was a larger number of unique species used in the Dominican Republic and a smaller number in New York, but of that, the number uniquely reported in New York City, a lot of those were food plants, which again, these all follow trends that we've seen with our work at the New York Botanical Garden. And then looking at these women's health conditions that were treated with medicinal plants, the top three women's health conditions also coincided in both locations. And the number one women's health condition that was treated with medicinal plants was gynecological infections, which includes vaginal infections as well as sexually transmitted diseases. And I've also highlighted feminine cleansing here because both gynecological infections and feminine cleansing have a similarity in how they are used. So plants used for these conditions are applied directly to the body, and therefore secondary plant compounds are interacting directly with the vaginal microbiota. So what is the vaginal microbiota? Why is that important? And so the vaginal microbiome itself is composed of lots of different bacterial species, but in healthy women, it's predominantly lactobacillus species. And these lactobacillus species are really important because they create an environment that reduces infection by both from bacteria that's already present as well as foreign pathogens. And so disruption of these lactobacillus species can increase the likelihood of infection. So a really good example of this is bacterial vaginosis, which is the number one reported vaginal infection in reproductive age women globally. And it's caused directly by the disruption of lactobacillus species and the proliferation of other bacteria naturally present. So thinking about these plants that are used for gynecological infections, as well as feminine cleansing, it's important to look at not only how they affect the pathogenic bacteria, as well as the vaginal microbiota, because if they're interacting negatively with the vaginal microbiota, then they're actually causing more likelihood of disease rather than preventing it. So taking all this back to my Haitian literature or my Haitian study. So the plants that were reported in New York City for women's health by Dominicans and the plants that I found from Haitian traditional medicine from the literature, there were 58 species that overlapped. And then of that 58 species, 10 of those species were used for gynecological infections by Dominicans in New York City. So those are these 10 at the bottom here. And then taking that a step further and seeing what's known about these in the biomedical literature. So I did a search looking to see what, what their potential effect would be on vaginal pathogens as well as the beneficial bacteria. And you can see here the ones I've highlighted in gray they had less than 15 articles just reporting their antibacterial properties generally. And then even the ones like aloe vera and Jatrophococcus that had a good amount of articles documenting their antibacterial properties, none of these 10 species had any kind of study focused on women's health, looking at vaginal infections or STIs, as well as the vaginal microbiota. So there's a need to look at these plants because there's a lot of women who are using these species for women's health. And in order for them to be truly effective, we need to investigate their effect on both. So that leads me to my future work, which will be, again, laboratory studies assessing medicinal plants used for gynecological infections, focusing on both the harmful and beneficial bacteria, as well as the responsible bioactive constituents. And kind of another aspect of this is looking at chemical variation across preparations. So when these species were reported in New York by Dominicans, it wasn't just one preparation per species. It was different plant parts and different extraction methods used for each species for the same purpose. So also looking at chemical variation across preparations as a way to address what might be the more optimal preparation of a species. And then the second being a Haitian ethnobotanical survey in New York City, which will be focused on women's health and can be used to make further cross-cultural comparisons with the Dominican community, as well as identify future plants for a laboratory study. And then the third most important part of my project will be giving all this information back to the Haitian community, one through a monograph of top reported species, as well as a contribution of a Haitian module to the Carlo E2 program. And so I would like to thank both the Haitian and Dominican communities in New York City, Botanicola 21 Division, which is owned by Mr. Lisu Trinidad, Dr. Margaret Alexander, who's a professor at York College at City University of New York, the Garden Club of America, as well as the Institute of Economic Botany at the New York Botanical Garden, and then the Graduate Center in Lehman College at the City University of New York.
Thank you so much, Ella. Excellent and very relevant research. So thank you so much for that. If there are any questions, please type them into the Q&A, or if you want to raise your hand, I can unmute you. Okay, Omari has their hand up, but that might have been from a previous, I'm unmuting you, Omari, but I don't know if that was from a previous speaker or not. Okay, I don't hear you, so we're going to move to the next question. Oh, Omari, go ahead. Did you have a question for the speaker?
Yeah, I just want to make a contribution in that actually gynecological problems and also urinogenital issues as pertains to ethnic botany has not so much been exploited. The world over, you just write a paper on that and you get a lot of response, people looking into your paper. And this is an area that we actually need to concentrate on in terms of research.
Thank you. I completely agree.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Omari. Okay, and then we have another question from Tara Pulidosalas. Okay, you can unmute yourself now if you'd like.
Yes, did you hear me?
No, we can hear you now, yes.
Yes, okay, thank you. It's very interesting. I was studying some medicinal plants in Yucatan Peninsula for some years ago. And I'm working still in Yucatan Peninsula. And for me, it's very interesting, especially in this area in IT, with so many problems of health, especially in poor people. But in this moment, I'm really curious about her viewpoint. Do you think it is possible, any possibility to look for any kind of studies about medicinal plants in the New York State? I'm thinking in, I don't know, native plants, of course, or considering all the people as immigrants from Latin America. What do you think about this possibility? I'm really curious.
Well, we've done, I mean, I think our urban ethnobotany work in New York has really been focused on the Caribbean communities, but we have worked with other groups from Latin America, like the Mexican community in New York City. So there's a lot of chance to expand there and keep working with different immigrant groups.
Okay, thanks.
Great, thank you so much. Any other questions? Okay, do we have another question from Talon? You can go ahead.
So I'm curious if you looked into kind of going off of what I think Omari was saying. Did you look into herbs used for men's reproductive health, and did you find any overlap? I remember there was the one plant you mentioned that was used for both men's and women's, but did you find a lot of that?
I didn't look at that specifically. I think there were a good number of men reporting just knowledge of women's health. I mean, plants used for women's health, and not necessarily because they use it, but just because they have the knowledge from, you know, their family and others. But I think there was some overlap in plants used for sexually transmitted infections, where I don't know if they were used for men's or women's health, but I just included all of them because they're likely doing the same things.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Well, thank you, Ella, and we'll move on to the next speaker now. So the next speaker is Grace Ward. Grace, feel free to unmute yourself and share your screen.
Thanks, John. Okay, so again, thank you, John, and also all of the other organizers from the Society for Economic Botany, and also to my fellow presenters today for some really excellent talks. So I'm Grace. I'm joining you all from St. Louis, where I'm a PhD student in the Department of Anthropology at Washington University in St. Louis. And I'm going to talk to you all about my ongoing archaeological and paleoethnobotanical work at the Jaketown site, which is located in the lower Mississippi Valley of the southeastern United States. And I'm interested in a period of time roughly 4,000 to 3,200 years ago, during which people living in the Mississippi Valley, this section of the Mississippi Valley, built large-scale earthworks typified by the constructions at Poverty Point in Northeast Louisiana. If anybody's ever been down through that part of the country, it's a really incredible place. So right during this time in which earthworks were being built, and also during which networks of exchange were established between different groups that spanned all of Eastern North America. So macrobotanical analysis thus far, so the analysis of plant remains from archaeological sites, from these sites that are roughly 4,000 years old, indicates that people in the lower Mississippi Valley associated with the Poverty Point material culture complex were had a food production system that was not based on domesticated plants. So that phrase there, a food production system not based on domesticated plants, might seem like a very clunky way to say what people now term agroforestry or wild plant tending. But this project that I'm going through right now, and I'm about 4 years into, has really become about this gap between the analytical lenses that we as paleoethnobotanists apply to understand ancient landscape management versus those lenses applied to the study of modern agroforestry systems by ethnobotanists and anthropologists, etc. So I would say we're at this point where, despite increased acknowledgement of some very human-affected ecosystems, and this ecosystem in the lower Mississippi Valley we can very much call human-affected, and I'm going to kind of show a timeline of sorts of land use for this part of the Mississippi Valley. So, right, so despite, we can say that there's been lots of work within ethnobotany and paleoethnobotany in the past couple decades to establish that lots of ecosystems that were previously considered wild, we can in fact call ecosystems that reflect the legacy of human impact, human management. And so the theories underlying this term largely come from historical ecology and have been developed and applied mostly in regions with a degree of resource landscape and deep time cultural continuity. So hence historical ecologists have come up with path-breaking theories regarding non-domesticate based food production systems working in the American Pacific Northwest and the Amazon basin. But down in the Mississippi Delta region, which is the name for this part of the valley that I'm interested in, like many places in the United States, landscape and cultural continuity across the divide of contact between Europeans and indigenous peoples is largely obscured. So we're dealing with, in many ways, a landscape from which deep time histories have been entirely erased. And so we can talk about, I have, going from the top corner, images from forests around the site where I'm working, which is in Belzona, Mississippi. And then artist rendering of what people have imagined life might have been like down there in the late Archaic, through to 19th and 20th century plantation agriculture. And here there's an image of sharecroppers. And then below, an image of people building a levee. So this work was obviously done in the plantation system by enslaved people up until post-Civil War, in which the sharecropping system kind of took over the same landscape. So we go through this to get to this image down here of the Jaketown site in summer of 2019. It's very flat and dry, and it's been farmed for centuries at this point. So again, the continuity from a previous form of use to now, there's acts of reconstruction that have to occur. So the processes by which I'm working through, the landscapes that I'm looking for to understand what wild plant management or agroforestry might have looked like in the late Archaic. I'm kind of looking for correlates in edge territories around Jaketown now, as well as, obviously reading about other temperate regions to reconstruct. So just here is an example of one of the kind of foresty areas near the Jaketown site, where you can see there's saw palmetto growing, also some pecan, and it's kind of a typical forestscape. Then you also have, of course, the floodplains and the banks of both the Mississippi itself and then tributaries and bayous. So this is one right by Poverty Point, the large site from this time period that I mentioned earlier. And then also wetlands, standing and seasonal. So again, these areas that we would expect to cover the entire region and to be the environments that people lived in back in the late Archaic are again entirely erased, and their remnants, searching for the remnants would be the subject of excavations at Jaketown thus far. Here's just a sketched site map to give kind of a spatial idea. So me and collaborators have been digging there for some time now. And to get down to the late Archaic component, we have to go fairly deep due to alluvial activity over the site. But from middens associated with the Poverty Point time period, the predominant plants thus far have been pecan and persimmon. which going back to the previous image of the little kind of forest tangle near Jaketown, again, these are things that we could expect to have been around. And again, so this is another context at Jaketown as well. Arrows pointing down to the late archaic component. And again, persimmon, pecan, and then also Chenopodium, which is a plant that becomes part of the Eastern Agricultural Complex, which is a complex of native domesticates that were extremely important to indigenous populations in Eastern North America prior to contact. So we have one of the plants associated with that complex here. And again, this is another section of the site, and you can see kind of the context from which these plants are coming again. And the charred remains are of this pretty tight sequence. So Jaketown looks, so far the macrobotanical remains, so the charred plant remains from Jaketown, are very similar to other sites of the same era. With some differences, there's a greater emphasis on persimmon, interestingly. And this is a graph showing ubiquity, so the percentage of samples in which a given taxa was identified. So back to that plant and back to the idea of this system that so far there's no signs of reliance on domesticates, but there is the presence of Chenopodium berlandieri. Likely there's some species questions there. And so the Poverty Point area where at this time there's all this incredible earthwork building and also the maintenance of these incredible trade networks is spatially removed from the areas in which the domestication of that complex is happening to the north. So in places like the Ozarks, the Illinois River Valley, parts of Kentucky and Tennessee. So we have evidence of people at Jaketown who are definitely consuming and have Chenopodium within their living spaces, and is a known and close plant to people, we can assume thus far based on the amount found. But these are people who are also in contact with people across this huge space, because again, material exchange, we can expect information exchange to be happening as well, and cultural interchange as well. So we kind of get to this point where if you map it all out, you see people at Jaketown and Poverty Point making this sort of potentially intentional choice to not follow what their far northern or relatively northern contemporaries are doing as far as going through the sort of processes that lead to the domestication of a given plant. So they're continuing to use this plant in its wild form, despite what we can, and this is part of the further direction of this research that seems pretty exciting, despite what seems to, so it seems as if there's this choice to maintain this connection to a wild, more agroforestry dependent system. Yeah. So that's what I have. And thank you to lots of collaborators. It's an archaeological project, so it's huge. And yes, thanks.
Great, thank you, Grace, so much. And I'll just say, beautiful pictures. And as I always tell my students, less is more when it comes to words on a slide. And I think that you did a very good job with that. So thank you so much. But a really great work. And I love the diversity of this symposium that we have botanists as well working on this. So perfect. So if anyone has any questions, please raise your hand or add a question to the Q&A. Okay, any questions? Few more seconds. Oh, we have one. Fernando, if you unmute yourself, you can ask your question.
Yes. No, was a very good presentation. Now, just to say that I'm reading the book from Jayle Fritz, Feeding Carioca.
Yeah.
And it's very nice. It's a very nice piece of work. Just to say that it's a very interesting book, and they describe all the situation of the different domestications in the Mississippi Valley. So it's very recommendable.
Gail's on the, she's actually listed as an attendee, so and she's your advisor, right? Is that right?
She is, yeah.
Okay.
So it is an excellent book, yeah.
Great. Thank you, Fernando. Let me just see, there's another question that came in. Oh, Tinda van Andel asks, if people at the site only collected wild plants, why did they build the earthworks?
That's if they only collect. So part of what's been really interesting about research at Jaketown and Poverty Point is this entire idea, just from the anthropological lens, of decoupling these markers of social complexity, i.e. monumentality, from necessarily domestication. So in that spatial difference of just even like the use of chenopodium, earthwork construction isn't happening to the north, but it is down at Poverty Point. And it's just one of those incredible examples of human social, or the social variability of people, in which you perhaps don't need agriculture to build huge, incredible places, which seems to be the case at Poverty Point. So the particulars were still, it's a large ongoing project to really answer how many people were in a place and how it altered the landscape and how they fed themselves, et cetera.
Great, and I see in the chat, Nancy asks, she says, fascinating suggestion about the preference for using wild crop resources. How did you identify the persimmon? Wood or pollen or fruit remains?
Seed remains. And also we believe we have almost like a charred pulp sort of structure. So it seems that we have, evidence of people processing persimmon en masse into a pulp, and then we have this burned kind of like disc shape of it, but it's mostly by seed, by charred seeds.
Wonderful. Great. Well, thank you so much, Grace. We're going to move on to the next presenter. Okay, our next presenter is Sarah Nilsson. Sarah, I see you're unmuted, so feel free to share your presentation.
Okay, do you see my screen okay? Oops. Do you see it okay? Oops.
Sorry, I was muted. Yes.
Okay. Hi, thank you so much, John. Thank you to Society for Economic Botany for inviting me to this talk today. I really enjoyed hearing such a varied amount of talks from all over the world. It was a great way to spend the afternoon. My name is Sarah Nilsson, and I'm a biology professor at Penn State University, where I work with my colleague Eric Burkhart and some other folks on non-timber forest species. One of our current projects is to study whether or not ramps, or Allium trichoccum, should be classified as a vulnerable plant in Pennsylvania, where they're being harvested at a much greater intensity than they have been in the past. So we are undertaking a big project to survey ramp populations throughout the state to study their genetics and their habitat preferences. And we're also collecting market and trade data on ramps to get a better sense of how stable or vulnerable these populations are. Today, I'm going to discuss some data that I analyzed while our spring field season was sidelined by COVID, some observations on how ramps grow over the harvest season and how this data can be used to promote ramp conservation and forest farming in ramps. So if you're not familiar with ramps, ramps, which are also called wild leeks, are a broad-leaved edible perennial plant in the Amaryllis family, and they grow in and are native to the forests of North America. They consist of a bulb and usually 3 to sometimes even 1 to 3 leaves, sometimes even 4 leaves. And Allium trichoccum can be found in 2 different color morphs. One is white and green, and the other one is red and purple, with the purple-red color being in the petiole and the sheath. Their color morphs can be found growing together in the same patch. What causes this coloration, whether it's genetics or environment, we don't know, but it's something that we're interested in finding out. So oftentimes that white color morph of Allium trichoccum is mistaken for another species of ramp called Allium burdickii. This is the narrow-leafed ramp. Allium burdickii is found in parts of PA, primarily in southwestern PA and throughout Ohio and Indiana. But to our knowledge, it's not extensively harvested in Pennsylvania. It has these very narrow leaves. It tends not to grow in large patches, and it's generally off the radar of most foragers. In its early stages, when it's first emerging, it actually resembles a sedge, so I think it's easily overlooked by most people. So ramps can be found throughout Appalachia from Georgia to Maine, and they're also predominant in the Great Lakes region, but our study is focused on Pennsylvania, which is found in the middle of the Appalachian Range. So here's a photo of one of our field sites in Pennsylvania, and this is indicative of typical ramp habitat. So ramps like to grow in deciduous forests, often in these really large patches, and we find them growing under sugar maples, cherries, poplars, and beech. They like moist, mesic, calcium-rich soil, and they like to grow on north-facing slopes, and sometimes we find them oftentimes too along floodplains. So ramps are one of the earliest plants to emerge in the spring. So in PA, that's early to mid-April, well before the canopy leaves out. And so what happens with ramps is by mid-May, the Pennsylvania ramps are usually full size. And at this point, they may reproduce asexually via bulb division when a single bulb grows and splits to form a new individual. And then by late May, we start to see the leaves begin to yellow and they start to decompose, and we see the emergence of the scape, which will appear, and it contains the flower buds, which actually won't open until July. And at that point, there's no more leaves remaining. You just kind of see these stems and flowers sticking up like lollipops in the forest. The flowers are pollinated by bumblebees and flies, but ramps can also reproduce via selfing. So they can reproduce asexually via bulb division, and then sexually via cross-pollination and also selfing. So ramps were originally harvested and consumed by the indigenous cultures of Eastern North America, including the Cherokee and different Algonquin cultures. And then later, the harvesting and consumption of ramps were adopted by early European settlers of Appalachia. So again, ramps come up really early in the spring, and they were consumed for their tonifying properties. They're also really high in vitamin C, and that most likely helped with winter scurvy that afflicted many of the settlers. And so today, ramp harvesting remains a culturally important foodway in parts of Appalachia. And in these communities, ramps are celebrated with community dinners. They have big ramp festivals where they sell not only ramps, but all kinds of products made with ramps. And the ramps that are sold and consumed are almost entirely foraged from the forest. So these are not grown extensively at all in an agroforestry system. And when they are harvested, typically the bulb and the leaves are harvested, so the entire individual plant is removed from the population. So a more sustainable harvest practice is to just remove a leaf from a plant, but these are highly perishable and also not practically for bringing to market, and many people really enjoy to eat the bulb. So the ramp was once this niche plant. It was only harvested in these pockets of Appalachia. It was consumed locally, but in the past 10 years, it has become a very, very trendy food product. It's all over Instagram. I have an example of #ramp season up there. You can see all the gourmet dishes that are being made with ramps. So the demand for ramps has really, really increased in urban markets, especially by restaurants. They're eager to showcase locally available ingredients after the winter lull on their menu. And we also see a lot of ramp patch location sharing on social media via Facebook or even iNaturalist. It's a great way to find out where your ramps are locally. It's really easy for people to locate these ramp patches and harvest them. It's common to find ramps now at farmers markets, large supermarkets, and co-ops in urban areas up and down the East Coast. And last season, we saw them for sale as much as $20 a pound at like local organic grocers. So we're really seeing an increase in demand for ramp, and we're also seeing an increase in demand for them earlier in the season, including when they first emerge from the soil. They're being sold as ramp sprouts. And so when we see this rapid increase of demand and consumption and price, it makes us a little bit concerned about conservation. Especially because there was the study that came out about 20 years ago by Rock et al. And this was a long-term population study done in the Great Smoky Mountain National Park. And the researchers observed that ramp populations were incredibly slow to recover following harvesting. And that a sustainable harvest level was only 10% of the population once per decade when they were harvesting the complete bulb. So this study led to a ban on ramp harvesting in Great Smoky Mountain National Park. And there's also a ban in Quebec on ramp digging, which is at the northern end of the ramps range. So given the slow rate of population recovery following bulb harvest, when thinking about how to balance out harvesting of ramps with conservation concerns, we wanted to understand how harvesting at different phenological stages could impact the number of individuals being removed from the population. So in 2018, ramp weight data was collected on ramps harvested from 3 sites located in Cambria County in southwestern Pennsylvania. And we did this at 7 phenological stages. So the first stage that was harvested was at emergence, when the bulbs were the diameter of a pencil and the leaves were still emerging. This is that new stage that's being marketed as ramp sprouts. We also looked at mid-season, when the bulbs were slightly swollen and the leaves were green and nearly fully expanded. And then late season had swollen bulbs, fully extended leaves, and the scape was just beginning to emerge. We also looked at post-season, when the leaves were beginning to get yellow and they were decomposing and the scapes were extended. Some people still harvest them at this stage, but they aren't really marketable. It's really only the diehards that will eat them once they start decomposing, at least the leaves start decomposing. The bulbs were also dug and weighed at flowering, fruiting, and also during dormancy, which again, the diehards will harvest them and dig them even at these stages. So, but mainly ramps are consumed broadly at the emergent, mid-season, and late season stages. So one site in Cambria County, we also sampled, we had data from 2013 and 2014. And then we sampled a few additional sites in Pennsylvania, just at the late season stage, because this was part of another project as well, in McKean, Wayne, and Bucks County. So what I'm showing here is the ramp weight data averaged over all our seasons and sites. And what we found was that total ramp weight rose dramatically over the course of the growing season, peaking at the late season when the bulb was swollen and the leaves were fully extended. And we actually found that ramp total weight increased from 2.6 grams to 7.2 grams between the emergent and late stages. And when you think about this in terms of how many ramps are being removed from the population, so I've shown this in the green boxes above the bars. So that's 174 ramps per pound at emergence versus only 63 ramps per pound during later season when the bulb has swollen. So this is a significant reduction in the number of individuals being removed from the population if we just wait a little bit longer into the growing season to harvest them. Oops, sorry. We also looked at the weight by stage and leaf number. So we see stark differences in ramp weight at each stage, depending on how many leaves the ramps have. So one-leafed ramps are very small, regardless of the stage. But 3-leafers are the largest at all stages, and they can weigh over 1,000 times more than one-leafed ramps, and over 68% more than 2-leafed ramps at late season stages. And at mid-season stage, 3-leafed ramps weighed over 750% more than 1-leafed ramps and 70% more than 2-leafed ramps. And again, from a population perspective, harvesting 1 pound of single leafers at the late stage amounts to 456 individuals that are being removed from that population on average versus 42 if they have 3 leaves. So selective harvesting of ramps based on leaf number at all these stages could really help reduce the harvest pressure on these natural populations. And I also just wanted to mention that we saw these differences between 2-leaf and 3-leaf ramps. It was consistent across all the growing seasons that we looked at. So 3-leaf ramps are consistently larger at all stages than the 2-leafers. So in conclusion, selective harvesting of 3-leaf ramps will yield larger ramps, and fewer individual ramps will be removed from the wild per pound of ramps collected. And also harvesting ramps at mid and late season, at least when the bulb has begun to swell, will also yield larger ramps. It will be less work for the diggers, and fewer individuals will be removed from the wild per pound of ramps harvested. Emergent ramp sprouts and 1-leafers really should be avoided when harvesting to reduce population losses. I want to just kind of include this little phrase, fewer ramps per pound means more ramps in the ground. I think this should be added as an additional ramp sustainable harvest practice, along with rotating between patches, harvesting one bulb from one undergoing bulb division, and harvesting only leaves when it is practical. So I just want to mention a few other questions we're currently pursuing. One is to include the extent of the ramp trade market in Pennsylvania and across, in our study in Pennsylvania, but it also needs to be done across Appalachia. We know very, very little about how many of these ramps are being dug from the wild and how many are being sold at market. I'm primarily a plant geneticist, and I'm particularly interested in measuring genetic diversity in ramp populations. This is also a big unknown, given that ramps can reproduce both sexually and asexually. And along these lines, I want to understand how that genetic diversity is distributed within and between populations, and also how harvesting can affect diversity is also a really interesting question. If we start harvesting all the big 3-leafed ramps, if those are the ones undergoing bulb division, how does that, removing those individuals from the population, affect diversity? And then finally, we're trying to figure out how we can best cultivate ramps. So we're looking at habitat characteristics, looking at soils, and this would help meet market demand, especially earlier in the growing season, and help us conserve some of these wild populations via cultivation of ramps. And I just want to thank my collaborators. So I want to thank Teal Jordan. Teal is the graduate student that dug and collected a lot of the ramp weight data. And she actually recently graduated and wrote a really cool thesis on how ramp phytochemistry changes during bulb development. So if you're interested in ramps, I highly recommend you check out her thesis. And also my colleagues, Eric Burkhart and Josh Lambert. And then this research was supported by grants from the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture and also the Pennsylvania Department of Conservation of Natural Resources. So thank you so much for your attention. I can answer any questions if we have time.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Nelson. What an inspiring example of applied ethnobotany for everyone to see. So thank you so much. We do have already one question in the Q&A, but please raise your hand if we have time for a question or two. Trish Flaster asks, if the ramps are harvested at a later date, are the bulbs still tender for consumption?
I haven't heard of any. I haven't eaten them at all stages, but I haven't heard any complaints about that. What Teal does know is that from her research is that the taste, or at least some of the phytochemicals that are important for giving ramps their bite, doesn't appear to change all that much, especially during the first 3 stages that I talked about.
Great. And Nancy asks, do you think that preferential harvest of 3-leaf plants could lead to unconscious selection for smaller plants? Do the smaller plants produce fewer seeds?
Oh, that's a great question. That's what we're trying to figure out, and we're hoping some of the genetics will work it out. Yeah, we need to do more demography on these and figure out, which plants are reproducing by seeds, which plants are reproducing asexually. I have a big question. If we do selectively pull out some of these larger ramps, is that going to leave like gaps in the patch that are actually going to allow seeds to establish? Because if you see these really dense patches, you can imagine it must be really, really difficult for seeds to actually germinate, because they're going to be quickly shaded by these leaves that are going to be coming out of the bulb. So there's a lot of really interesting questions on how harvesting and the genetics interact.
Great. And Tedja van Asseldonk asks, Sarah, greetings from Europe. This looks a lot like allium or cynum, quite a popular wild vegetable here, but we eat only the leaves. Is that not a possibility for you folks?
It is, and as I mentioned, like that is the best, most sustainable way to harvest them, but they are really hard to market that way. And the people that really enjoy eating ramps, they like the bulbs. There's more to it, and they last longer. I mean, they could be stored so much longer than if you just harvest the leaves. But that is the ideal way to harvest them.
Great, and Maxime Leloup asks, thanks for this great presentation. Up to what extent can leaf only harvesting be sustainable for ramp population? Do you know how many times one can harvest leaves only without compromising individuals' life?
We don't know that yet. No, we don't know that. So that is another really great question. It's got to be better for the populations, though, than actually digging up the whole individual. So that's another great question.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Nilsson. We appreciate your presentation. And that concludes the presentations today. I want to thank all the attendees for sticking through the 4 hours or so that we had together. We hope to have more of these. Perhaps, let me just unstop Sarah's presentation. Yeah, we hope to have more of these, perhaps one in the spring or another time. So if you have students, or you are a student, or you're just a researcher who would like to present, please start thinking about things that you might want to add. And of course, we do still plan on having our in-person meeting in Jamaica in next summer. So you can look for a call for abstracts for that event sometime probably in December. But we'll also be thinking about whether we will still be holding that, of course. I want to briefly share the website for the Society for Economic Botany for those of you who are new to the Society or haven't or are not members yet. So let me just do that. So this is the Society webpage. www.econbot.org. If you are interested in joining or you need to renew your membership, you'll see in the upper right-hand corner is the join button, which will take you to learn all about the advantages of membership. We would love to have you all be members. If you've stuck through the presentation, then we think that you'd be excellent for a membership. And you'll see there's all these different resources on the website, from funding and awards. You see that there's many different types of awards that we give every year, including Gail Fritz's book, which won Finding Cahokia, which won the Klinger Book Award this year, that was mentioned during the conversations. Education and outreach, which we had some questions about, what type of work are we doing in that? And of course, the student group, which maintains its own blog, and the social media accounts that we have as well. So I just want to give you all the heads up on that, and I hope that you'll take the time to explore the website and perhaps join the Society. Also, feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions, or to the Society itself. I'm sure if you search my name, you can find me, but I work at Harvard and at the Rockefeller Foundation, and you can reach me at either of the email addresses you might find online, but jdelaparra@rockfound.org is my Rockefeller email address, and you're welcome to reach out to me. We'd love to hear your feedback on this as well. So feel free to do that and let us know. One thing that I think might be interesting is it would probably be better if all the people that were in attendance, which we had about 150, I think at the maximum, were able to talk to each other. Of course, you can talk to each other in the chat, but perhaps we might incorporate some breakout sessions or ways that we can connect better, and that you can connect with the panelists in some more intimate way. So be happy to hear about that. Nancy, I don't know if maybe you want to say a few words. Nancy, if you joined late, Nancy is the current president of the Society for Economic Botany, so I'll let her close things out for us. And one more word, I just want to thank all the panelists as well. I see almost all of them have stayed to the very end. What an amazing collection of very interesting research that I'm so glad we had the opportunity to hear in a time when it's more difficult perhaps to be able to have these types of conversations and to have a global perspective. Despite some early technical difficulties, we worked through them, and then we got to hear some amazing research from all corners of the world. So thank you all very much, and I'll turn it over to Nancy now.
Well, yeah, I wanted to say thank you as well. That was pretty fabulous. Lots of really great and very different. I love the fact that we had so many people from working in different areas, working both of the world as well as conceptually. And so there was something for everybody. And I know we're all worried and wondering what's going to happen in terms of our ability to get together in person this coming summer. And we're still judging that. We're going to have to make a decision relatively soon for the people who are organizing that for us. But regardless, this was a really resounding success, I think. I thought this went spectacularly well. It was fascinating. We saw a lot of really fabulous work. So either way, I think we will try to continue to do these smaller conferences as long as we can, twist the arms of really wonderful people like John to help us to organize these things. It was a mountain of work, and he really worked on that. And I really appreciate all of you for stepping up and agreeing to present to us all here. And thank you everyone for attending, because it was pretty fabulous. So I guess I don't want to hang you out too much because you're probably like, God, I need to off this place.
Well,
so it was wonderful to see everyone.
One last note that we did record the presentations. So if you have other people that want to watch us, and for panelists, I sent out an email. So we need your permission to put this publicly. So if you want to give that permission, respond to that email, and then we'll post it as soon as we get everyone's permission. So thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone. Have a wonderful evening.
Bye-bye.